The bucket of water hit the stone floor and shattered into 100 silver drops before Isolde even understood why her hands were shaking. Somewhere above her, in the north tower of the old fortress, a bell had begun to ring, fast and broken, the kind of ringing that only meant one thing in Alderath. Riders were coming, and riders never came at this hour unless the news was bad. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the corridor, her plain gray dress soaked through at the knees, and listened. Boots pounded across the courtyard outside. Voices rose and fell, sharp with urgency. Somewhere a horse screamed, the sound cutting through the night like a blade. Isolde had learned, in her 3 years serving in this house, that the sound of running feet after dark meant one of two things. Either the enemy had found them, or someone important was about to die. She did not wait to find out which. She grabbed the empty bucket, straightened her spine, and walked toward the sound instead of away from it, because that was what a servant was supposed to do. Servants did not hide. Servants did not ask questions. Servants appeared exactly when they were needed, and vanished the moment they were not. And Isolde had spent every day of the last 3 years perfecting the art of being invisible in plain sight. It was a skill that had saved her life more than once. The great hall of General Draven Voss's fortress was already full of noise by the time she reached it. Men in muddy coats crowded around the long table, shouting over each other, pointing at a map that had been unrolled so quickly that one corner still curled up like a leaf. Isolde slipped along the wall, collecting empty cups, refilling a jug of water, making herself small among the chaos. No one looked at her. No one ever really looked at her. That was the point. They crossed the Ilvain River 2 hours ago, a young officer was saying, his voice cracking with exhaustion. 3,000 men. Maybe more. General Halden's outpost never had a chance. And Halden? Someone asked. The officer did not answer. He did not need to. A heavy silence dropped over the room, the kind of silence that made even seasoned soldiers look at their boots. Isolde kept pouring water into cups that were already full, because it gave her hands something to do besides tremble. General Halden had visited this fortress only 2 weeks earlier. He had complimented the bread she'd baked and asked her name, and she had told him a false one, the way she told everyone a false name, because the real one had died the night her family did, 16 years ago. At the head of the table stood General Draven Voss, and even in a room full of frightened men, he was the only one who looked as though he had not slept in days and did not intend to start now. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a short dark beard and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale gray and impossible to read. He had led the resistance against King Cassian Thorn for nearly 4 years, ever since Thorn had seized the throne in a single bloody night and declared the old royal bloodline extinct. Draven had lost 2 brothers to that night. He did not talk about it. He simply fought, day after day, year after year, with the tired determination of a man who no longer remembered what victory would feel like, but refused to stop reaching for it anyway. "How many days until they reach us?" Draven asked, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise. The room quieted immediately. 5, maybe 6 if the weather holds against them, answered Colonel Garrett Fenn, his second in command, a stocky man with a scar across one eyebrow and a habit of chewing the inside of his cheek when he was worried. He was worried now. "Then we have 5 days to decide whether we run or whether we finally give the other generals a reason to stop arguing and fight beside us." Draven's eyes swept the room. "Send riders to Blackwood and to Captain Vance. Tell them the enemy is moving faster than we predicted. If we do not unite now, Thorn will pick us apart one outpost at a time, the same way he picked apart Halden's men tonight." Isolde kept her eyes down and her hands busy, but she was listening to every word, the way she always listened. It was a habit that had kept her alive since she was a small child hiding beneath a floorboard while men with torches searched her family's home. She had learned to become part of the furniture, part of the walls, a shadow with a pulse. Nobody suspected a shadow of anything. She finished refilling the last cup and turned to leave, and that was when she felt it, the familiar weight settling low in her chest, the same feeling she got every time she overheard the resistance losing ground. It was not fear exactly, it was something heavier than fear. It felt almost like guilt, though she could never explain to herself why a servant girl should feel guilty about a war she had no power to change. Except that was not entirely true, and she knew it, even if she never let herself think about it for more than a few seconds at a time. She slipped out of the great hall and into the narrow servants' corridor that ran along the back of the fortress, her footsteps quiet on the worn stone. The corridor smelled of smoke and boiled cabbage, and the particular dampness that never quite left old buildings in the north. She passed the kitchen, where the cook, a wide, kind woman named Peg, was arguing with a boy about whether there was enough flour left to make bread for another week. She passed the laundry room, silent and dark at this hour. She climbed the narrow stairs to the small chamber she shared with 2 other servant girls, both of whom were already asleep, exhausted from the day's work, unaware that the war had just taken a sharp and dangerous turn only 2 floors below them. Isolde did not sleep. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot, listening to the fortress settle into an uneasy quiet, the shouting downstairs fading into low, urgent murmurs. When she was certain the other girls were truly asleep, she reached beneath her cot and pulled out a small wooden box, plain and unremarkable, the kind of box a servant might keep buttons or thread in. She had carried it with her through every home she had ever lived in since she was 4 years old. She ran her thumb along the worn edge of the lid, feeling the familiar grooves her fingers had traced 1,000 times before, and opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of folded cloth, was a thin circlet of tarnished metal, stripped long ago of any jewels or polish that might have caught the light and given it away. It looked, to anyone who did not know better, like a piece of cheap costume jewelry, the sort of thing a traveling actor might wear in a play, about kings and queens who never really existed. It did not look like a symbol that an entire kingdom had once bled for. It did not look like the last surviving proof that the royal bloodline of Alderath had not, in fact, ended on the night the palace burned. But Isolde knew what it was. She had known since she was old enough to understand the words her nursemaid whispered to her in the dark, the words that had shaped every choice she had made since. Her name was not the name she gave to soldiers and cooks and colonels. Her blood was not common blood, and the crown in her hands, hidden beneath her cot in a servant's chamber in a war-torn fortress, was the last piece of a kingdom that everyone believed was already lost. She closed the box gently and held it against her chest, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat, steady and slow despite everything. Somewhere below her, men were preparing for a battle that might decide the fate of the entire resistance. Somewhere out there, an army was marching toward them with enough strength to crush what little hope remained. And somewhere inside herself, in a place she rarely allowed herself to visit, Isolde wondered, not for the first time, how much longer she could keep pretending to be nobody. The nursemaid who raised her, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman named Marin, had made her promise one thing above all others on the night she died. Do not reveal yourself until the people are ready to fight for a queen, not just a cause. Wait until the moment finds you. You will know it when it comes. Isolde had waited 12 years since that promise was made. She had scrubbed floors in 3 different households, buried 2 more caretakers to illness, and 1 to an enemy raid, and learned to disappear so completely that even she sometimes forgot, for whole stretches of ordinary days, that she was anyone other than the servant girl everyone believed her to be. She had told herself, more times than she could count, that the moment Marin spoke of might never come, that perhaps the kingdom would fall entirely before it ever needed a queen again, that perhaps she would carry this box, and this secret, and this crushing weight of a name she could never speak, all the way to her own quiet, unremarkable death. But tonight, listening to the fear in Colonel Fenn's voice, and the exhaustion in General Voss's eyes, something in her had shifted, quietly and without warning, like the first crack spreading across a frozen lake. She did not know yet what that shift meant. She only knew that she felt it, deep and undeniable, and that for the first time in years, the weight of the crown in her hands felt less like a burden she was carrying, and more like a question she could no longer avoid answering. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters of the small window above her cot. Somewhere far to the north, an army was crossing dark fields toward them, unstoppable, and growing closer with every hour. And somewhere much closer, in a great hall 2 floors below, a general who did not know her name was preparing to lead his men into a battle he was not certain they could win. Isolde placed the box carefully back beneath her cot, lay down on top of her thin blanket without bothering to undress, and stared up at the cracked ceiling above her. Sleep did not come easily. It rarely did anymore. But as the fortress finally quieted around her, and the last murmurs of frightened officers faded into silence, she found herself thinking, not of the danger marching toward them, but of the strange, uncomfortable question that had followed her up the stairs and refused to leave. What if the moment Marin had spoken of was closer than she had ever let herself believe? Morning came gray and cold, the kind of light that made the fortress look older and more tired than it already was. Isolde rose before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, as she did every day, and began the long list of tasks that filled her hours from dawn until well past dark. She fetched water from the well in the lower courtyard, her breath fogging in the chilled air. She carried firewood up 3 flights of stairs to the officers' quarters. She helped Peg in the kitchen, kneading dough with hands that ached from the cold, listening to the cook mutter about how there would not be enough grain to last the month if the roads to the southern villages stayed closed. Everywhere she went, the fortress buzzed with the same nervous energy she had felt in the great hall the night before. Soldiers checked their weapons twice, 3 times, as though counting them again might somehow change how few they had. Messengers came and went at all hours, their horses lathered with sweat, their faces drawn tight with news nobody wanted to hear out loud. The enemy army continued its slow, terrible march southward, and every report that arrived seemed to shrink the distance between the fortress and disaster just a little further. Isolde carried water to the training yard in the early afternoon, where a group of young recruits, some barely older than boys, practiced with wooden swords under the watchful eye of a grizzled instructor. She recognized one of them, a lanky, freckled youth named Corin, who had arrived at the fortress only a month earlier, after his village was burned. He caught her eye as she set the water barrel down near the fence and offered her a small, tired smile. "They say the whole army is coming here," Corin said quietly, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Straight to us, not to Blackwood's camp, not to the coast, here." "Then you had better learn to hold that sword properly," Isolde replied, keeping her voice light, though the words settled uneasily in her stomach. "A wooden blade will not do you much good against steel, if you cannot even keep your grip when the instructor shouts." Corin laughed despite himself, and for a moment, the fear in his eyes eased just slightly. It was a small thing, she knew, a few words exchanged between a servant and a frightened recruit. But small things mattered more than people realized, especially in a place where fear spread faster than any illness. Isolde had learned long ago that a calm voice, offered at the right moment, could hold a person together far longer than they expected. She left the training yard and made her way back toward the kitchens, her path taking her past the open door of the map room, where General Voss stood alone, studying the same unrolled map from the night before. He had not moved from that position in hours, or so it seemed. His hands braced against the table, his shoulders set in the particular way that told Isolde, without needing to be told directly, that he had not slept at all. She should have walked past without stopping. That was the rule she lived by, the rule that had kept her safe for 16 years. Do not linger. Do not draw attention. Be seen only when seeing you serves a purpose. But something made her pause in the doorway, just for a moment, just long enough to notice the deep lines of exhaustion carved into his face, the way his jaw was clenched so tightly, it looked as though it might ache for days afterward. "General," she said quietly, before she could stop herself, "shall I bring you something to eat? You have not left this room since last night." He looked up, startled, as though he had forgotten anyone else existed in the fortress at all. His pale gray eyes settled on her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, a kind of curiosity that had not been there in their previous brief encounters. Isolde felt the familiar instinct to lower her gaze, to shrink back into the safety of invisibility, but she held herself steady instead. "I do not have time to eat," he said, though his voice had softened slightly. "But thank you. You will have less time to lead your men into battle if you collapse from hunger before they even arrive," Isolde replied, surprising herself with the boldness of her own words. Draven studied her for a long moment, and she felt her pulse quicken beneath the calm surface of her expression. Servants did not speak to generals this way. Servants did not offer opinions, did not push back, did not stand in doorways studying the exhaustion on a commander's face, as though they had any right to notice it. But something in his eyes told her he did not mind. If anything, the corner of his mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly, into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "What is your name?" he asked. The question landed harder than she expected. She had been asked it before, by soldiers and officers and even, once, by General Halden himself, and she had always answered smoothly, without hesitation, giving the false name she had carried for over a decade. But something about the way Draven asked it, quiet and genuinely curious rather than merely polite, made the lie catch in her throat for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Elsa," she said. "My name is Elsa." He nodded slowly, as though testing the name against something in his memory, and finding it unfamiliar. "Well, Elsa, perhaps I will accept that food after all." She returned 20 minutes later, with bread, cheese, and a bowl of thin broth, setting it carefully on the corner of the map table, away from the ink markings and pinned notes that covered its surface. Draven barely glanced at the food, his eyes still fixed on the map, tracing a line along the Ilvain River with one calloused finger. Isolde lingered longer than she should have, watching him work, and it was in that lingering moment that she noticed something that made her breath catch. His finger had stopped on a small, faded mark near the edge of the map, close to the old royal seal that still remained printed in one corner from whenever the parchment had first been drawn, decades before the current war had even begun. It was a mark that meant nothing to most people who studied it, but Isolde recognized it instantly, because it was the same symbol pressed into the metal of the circlet hidden beneath her cot. She forced her expression to remain neutral, forced her feet to carry her calmly out of the room, though her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he must have heard it. It was only a coincidence, she told herself. An old map, drawn before the palace fell, would naturally still carry the royal seal. It meant nothing. It changed nothing. And yet, as she walked back toward the kitchens, the wooden box beneath her cot felt heavier in her mind than it had in years, and the strange, uncomfortable question from the night before returned to her with new and unsettling force. What if the moment was not simply approaching? What if it had already, quietly, without her permission, begun? By evening, the fortress had settled into the strange, restless calm that always seemed to fall over a place bracing for something it could not stop. Isolde carried trays of food to the wounded, who had straggled in from Halden's ruined outpost. Men with bandaged arms and hollow eyes, who flinched at every loud noise and refused to speak of what they had seen. She sat with one of them for a while, an older soldier named Paran, who had once served under her own family before the palace fell, though he did not know that, and never would, unless she chose to tell him. "You have a steady hand," Paran told her, as she helped him drink from a cup he could not hold himself, his fingers too badly burned to grip anything properly. "And a steadier voice. Whoever raised you did well." "She did," Isolde said softly, thinking of Marin, of the small cottage, where she had spent her childhood, learning to read maps by candlelight, and memorizing the old royal histories that no one else was supposed to teach her. "She taught me most of what I know." Paran studied her for a moment, the way exhausted men sometimes studied things too closely, searching for meaning in small details simply because they had nothing else left to hold on to. "You remind me of someone," he said slowly. "I cannot place who. It will come to me." Isolde smiled and changed the subject, guiding him gently toward talk of easier things, of the bread Peg had baked that morning, and the rumor that the southern roads might reopen within the week. It was a skill she had honed over years of practice, this careful redirecting of dangerous conversations before they could grow roots. She had done it 1,000 times before, with soldiers who half remembered a face from the old court, with traveling merchants who commented on the shape of her eyes, with anyone whose memory reached back far enough to almost, but never quite, recognize her. It always worked. It had always worked, for 16 years. But something about tonight felt different, and she could not fully explain why. Perhaps it was the exhaustion in Draven's eyes as he studied that old map. Perhaps it was the mark of the royal seal, faded but unmistakable, resting so close beneath his fingertip. Perhaps it was simply the slow, grinding approach of an army large enough to end the resistance entirely, and the quiet, insistent voice inside her that kept asking what good a hidden crown would do anyone if there was no kingdom left to wear it for. She finished her rounds long after the sun had set, the fortress lit only by scattered torches and the pale glow of a rising moon. As she climbed the narrow stairs toward the servants' quarters, she passed the small chapel that had once been used for royal blessings, and was now mostly forgotten, its wooden pews dusty, its altar bare except for a single unlit candle. She paused in the doorway, unable to explain the pull she felt toward the quiet, empty room. She stepped inside and knelt before the altar, not out of any formal faith, but out of habit, the same habit Marin had instilled in her as a child. "Close your eyes," Marin used to say. "Ask the question honestly, even if you do not like the answer that comes back." Isolde closed her eyes now, in the flickering dark of the abandoned chapel, and asked herself the only question that mattered. Was she ready? Was the kingdom ready? Was this, finally, after 12 long years of waiting, the moment Marin had promised would come? No answer arrived, not immediately, not in any voice she could hear, but when she opened her eyes again, the tightness in her chest had eased slightly, replaced by something steadier, something that felt almost like resolve. She did not yet know what she would do with the crown hidden beneath her cot, or when, or how. But she knew, with sudden and startling clarity, that the waiting was drawing to a close, whether she was ready for it or not. Outside, the wind continued to sweep across the dark fields surrounding the fortress, carrying with it the distant, unmistakable sound of an army still marching closer with every passing hour. Somewhere among those soldiers marched the forces of a king who believed the true royal bloodline had ended in fire 16 years earlier. He did not know, could not have known, that the proof of his lie slept quietly each night in a servant's chamber, wrapped in cloth, hidden beneath a narrow cot, waiting for the moment it would finally be ready to be seen. The rumor reached the kitchens before it reached the officers, the way rumors always seem to travel fastest among the people with the least power to change anything. Peg heard it first, from a stable boy, who heard it from a courier, who claimed to have heard it directly from a merchant traveling up from the southern provinces. By the time it reached Isolde's ears, scrubbing pots in the corner of the kitchen with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, the story had grown, as stories always did, but its core remained the same. They said the lost crown of Alderath still existed. They said it had survived the fire that destroyed the palace 16 years earlier, hidden away by loyalists before the flames could reach it, and that whoever carried it now held the last true claim to the throne that King Cassian Thorn had stolen. They said the crown was not just a symbol but a key, capable of uniting the scattered rebel factions who had spent 4 years fighting separately, arguing over leadership, refusing to trust one another enough to fight as one. "Nonsense," Peg declared, wiping her hands on her apron with the particular briskness of a woman who did not believe in fairy tales. "If there really was a royal heir left alive, don't you think she would have shown herself by now? 16 years of hiding, waiting for what exactly? For the kingdom to burn down entirely before she bothers to help put it out?" Isolde kept her eyes on the pot in front of her, scrubbing at a stain that had already come clean, and said nothing. "Besides," Peg continued, warming to her subject as she always did when given an audience, "even if there was a crown, even if there was an heir, what good would it do now? Thorn has the larger army. He has the fortresses. He has the loyalty of half the nobles who were too frightened, or too greedy, to fight back when he took the throne. A crown does not win battles, swords do." "Perhaps," Isolde said quietly, "a crown does not win battles alone, but perhaps it gives men a reason to pick up their swords in the first place." Peg glanced at her, one eyebrow raised, as though surprised by the thoughtfulness of the reply. "You sound like you have given this a great deal of thought for a girl who scrubs pots all day." Isolde forced a small laugh and shrugged, returning her attention to her work before the older woman could study her expression too closely. "It is only a rumor, like you said. But rumors are interesting, are they not? Even when they are not true." She spent the rest of the afternoon turning the conversation over in her mind, unsettled by how quickly the rumor had spread, how far it had already traveled from whatever whispered origin had first given it life. She wondered who had started it, and why now, of all times, when the enemy army was drawing closer with every passing day. Perhaps it was nothing more than desperate men, grasping for hope in the face of overwhelming odds, inventing legends out of thin air, because reality had become too heavy to bear without one. Or perhaps, and this thought frightened her far more, someone somewhere had learned something true. That evening, she overheard 2 officers discussing the same rumor as they passed through the corridor near the kitchens, their voices lowered, but not quiet enough to escape her notice. "Blackwood is taking it seriously," one of them said. "He has sent riders across 3 provinces, trying to track down anyone who might have served in the old palace. Says if the crown is real, and if it can be found before Thorn's men find it first, it could change everything." "And if it is not real?" the other asked. "If it is only a story invented by frightened villagers to give themselves something to hope for? Then we have wasted valuable riders chasing shadows while an army marches straight toward us." But Blackwood does not seem willing to take that risk. He would rather chase a shadow than ignore a chance, however small, of turning the tide. Isolde pressed herself further into the shadow of the doorway, listening long after the officers had passed, her mind racing. General Orrin Blackwood commanded the largest remaining rebel force outside of Draven's own fortress, and if he was sending riders across 3 provinces searching for any trace of the lost heir, then the rumor had grown far larger, far faster than she had ever imagined possible. It was no longer simply gossip exchanged among frightened kitchen staff and weary soldiers. It had become a serious pursuit, one with resources and urgency behind it, and that changed everything. She returned to the servants' quarters that night, more troubled than she had been in years. She sat on the edge of her cot for a long time, before finally reaching beneath it and pulling out the familiar wooden box, running her fingers along its worn edges, as she had done 1,000 times before. She did not open it. She simply held it, feeling the weight of it settle into her hands, and thought about everything Marin had ever told her about the choice she would one day have to make. "Wait until the moment finds you," Marin had said. "You will know it when it comes." But what if the moment was not something she could simply wait for? What if it required her to reach out and grab it herself, before someone else claimed it in her place? Or worse, before Thorne's forces found some way to twist the rumor into a trap designed to draw her, or anyone who might be her, out into the open. She thought, too, of General Voss, and the strange, lingering look he had given her the day before, and the way his finger had rested so briefly on the old royal seal pressed into the corner of his map. She wondered if he had heard the same rumor circulating through the fortress, and if he had, whether it had crossed his mind even for a moment that the servant girl who brought him bread and broth might know more about it than she let on. She doubted it. Draven Voss was a practical man, a soldier through and through, not given to chasing legends when there were real armies to worry about. He had dismissed the very idea of the lost crown once already, in the Great Hall, calling it folklore in front of his officers. It seemed unlikely he would suddenly begin suspecting a quiet servant of holding the answer to a mystery he did not even believe existed. And yet, some small, cautious part of her could not stop replaying the moment his pale gray eyes had settled on her in the doorway of the map room, sharp and curious, in a way that felt different from how anyone else had ever looked at her before. The days that followed passed in a blur of tense preparation. The fortress braced itself for the arrival of the enemy army, now confirmed to be only 3 days away by the latest riders. Soldiers reinforced the outer walls. Blacksmiths worked through the night forging what weapons they could from whatever metal remained. Isolde continued her ordinary duties, carrying water, mending clothes, comforting the wounded, all while the rumor of the lost crown continued to spread, growing stranger and more elaborate with each retelling, until even the youngest recruits in the training yard were whispering about it between sword drills. "They say she has already been seen," Corin told her one afternoon, his young face bright with the particular excitement of someone who desperately wanted to believe in something larger than the war around him. A woman traveling with the crown, moving from village to village, gathering support in secret. "Who says this?" Isolde asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral, even as her pulse quickened. "Everyone. It is all anyone talks about anymore," Corin shrugged, tightening the strap on his wooden practice sword. "Do you think it is true?" Isolde looked out across the training yard, toward the gray horizon where, somewhere beyond the hills, an army continued its slow and terrible approach, and toward the fortress walls, where soldiers worked tirelessly to prepare for a battle they might not survive. She thought of the box hidden beneath her cot, and the promise she had carried for 12 long years, and the strange, insistent feeling that had been building inside her since the night the bell first rang in the North Tower. "I think," she said slowly, "that people believe what they need to believe, especially when the alternative is too frightening to face. Whether the crown is real or not, the hope it gives people is real enough. Perhaps that is all that matters, for now." Corin nodded, seemingly satisfied by the answer, and returned to his training. But Isolde remained standing at the fence for a long while after he had gone, watching the recruits practice their clumsy sword strikes against wooden posts, and wondering, with a growing sense of urgency she could no longer ignore, how much longer the truth could remain buried beneath the false name she had worn for 16 years. That night, as she lay awake listening to the wind rattle the shutters above her cot, she made a quiet, private decision that she did not yet fully understand the weight of. She would watch, and she would wait, just a little longer, for the sign Marin had always promised would come. But she would no longer simply hide. She would begin, carefully and quietly, to prepare herself for the moment when hiding was no longer an option at all. Because somewhere beyond the fortress walls, an army was closing in, and somewhere within them, a rumor was spreading faster than any soldier could ride, and somewhere deep inside herself, Isolde could feel the last threads of her old, careful life beginning, slowly and irreversibly, to unravel. 2 days before the enemy army was expected to reach the fortress, a courier arrived from General Blackwood's camp, exhausted and mud-spattered, carrying a sealed letter meant only for Draven's eyes. Isolde watched from across the courtyard as the courier was rushed inside, and within the hour, word spread through the fortress that an emergency council would be held that evening, gathering not just Draven's officers, but representatives from Blackwood's forces, and Captain Leora Vance's coastal regiment as well. It was the first time in nearly a year that all 3 major branches of the resistance had agreed to meet in one place at one time, and the timing, so close to the arrival of Thorn's army, felt to Isolde like something more than coincidence. She was assigned, along with 2 other servants, to prepare the great hall for the gathering, setting out cups and pitchers of water, sweeping the stone floor, arranging chairs around the long table where the map still lay unrolled from days before. She worked quickly and quietly, listening to the low murmur of officers already beginning to arrive, their voices tense with the particular energy of people who knew they were about to make decisions that could not be undone. Captain Leora Vance arrived first, a lean, sharp-featured woman with close-cropped hair and a reputation for outmaneuvering enemy ships along the coast, despite commanding a fraction of the vessels Thorn's navy possessed. She greeted Draven with a brisk nod and immediately began studying the map, her fingers tracing possible routes the enemy army might take once it reached the fortress walls. "You look like a woman who has not slept in a week," Draven remarked, though there was no judgment in his tone, only the weary recognition of a fellow commander who understood the feeling all too well. "I have not," Vance replied. "Neither have you, from the look of things. Perhaps that is why the 2 of us keep finding reasons to hold these councils. Misery loves company, or so they say." General Blackwood arrived shortly after, a heavy-set man with a thick gray beard and a booming voice that seemed to fill the great hall the moment he stepped through the door. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own judgment, a trait that had made him both an effective commander and, according to whispers Isolde had overheard many times before, an occasionally difficult ally. "Draven," Blackwood said, clasping the younger general's forearm in greeting. "I hear Thorn's forces are 3 days out. We do not have time for pleasantries, so let us skip straight to the matter that brought me here." The council began in earnest, as the last of the officers filed in and took their places around the table. Isolde retreated to the edge of the room, as was expected of her, ready to refill cups and attend to whatever small needs arose during the meeting, invisible once again among the gathered leaders of the resistance. "The rumor of the lost crown has reached every corner of the southern provinces," Blackwood announced without preamble, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "I have sent riders to investigate its origin, and while I cannot yet confirm whether the crown itself is real, I can confirm that the rumor is doing exactly what a symbol of hope is meant to do. Villages that refused to send men to fight only a month ago are now asking how they might join the resistance. Farmers are hiding grain from Thorn's tax collectors for the first time in years. Whether or not a living heir exists, the belief that one might is already changing the shape of this war. Belief is not the same as truth," Draven said carefully. "And chasing a rumor while an army marches toward our walls seems to me a dangerous distraction from the battle we actually need to win." "I do not disagree," Blackwood replied. "But consider this. If the rumor alone can inspire farmers to defy Thorn's tax collectors, imagine what proof might accomplish. If we could find the crown, or the heir who carries it, and bring her before the people, truly before them, not as a whispered story, but as a living, breathing symbol, standing at the head of our forces, we would not merely be fighting a war of soldiers and steel. We would be fighting a war the people themselves believe they can win." Captain Vance nodded slowly, her sharp eyes moving between the two generals. There is wisdom in that. Soldiers fight harder for a cause they can see and touch than for one that exists only in strategy and numbers on a map. If the heir is real, and if she can be found, she may be worth more to this resistance than an entire additional regiment. And if she is not real? Draven pressed. If we spend what little time and resources we have left chasing a legend, only to find nothing but disappointment when Thorn's army reaches our walls? The hall fell quiet for a long moment, the weight of the question settling over the gathered officers. Isolde stood perfectly still near the far wall, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression carefully arranged into the practiced blankness of someone who was not truly listening, even as every word landed like a stone dropped into deep water within her. Then we fight the battle in front of us, with the men we already have, Blackwood said finally, his booming voice quieter now, more measured. But I would rather have hoped and lost than never hoped at all. This war has ground on for 4 years, Draven. Men are tired, they are frightened. They need something to believe in beyond the next battle, the next retreat, the next impossible odds we somehow manage to survive. If there is even the smallest chance that the crown is real, I intend to keep searching for it. The council continued late into the evening, moving between discussions of troop placement, supply lines, and the defense of the fortress walls, but the question of the lost crown lingered beneath every exchange, unresolved and unsettling. Isolde moved quietly among the officers, refilling cups, clearing empty plates, listening to every word with an intensity she was careful never to let show on her face. By the time the council finally ended, well past midnight, the officers filing out of the great hall with tired, determined expressions, Isolde understood with sudden and undeniable clarity that the world around her had shifted in ways she could no longer ignore. The rumor was no longer simply a story whispered among servants and frightened villagers. It had become a strategy, a hope, a weapon that generals themselves were beginning to reach for in the absence of anything else strong enough to hold their crumbling resistance together. And somewhere beneath her own narrow cot, wrapped carefully in cloth inside a plain wooden box, lay the very thing they were searching for. As she extinguished the last of the candles in the empty great hall and made her way back toward the servants' quarters, Isolde felt, for the first time in 12 long years, the true and terrible weight of what Marin had asked her to carry. It was one thing to hide a secret when no one was looking for it. It was an entirely different thing to hide it while an entire kingdom, generals and farmers and frightened soldiers alike, had already begun, without knowing it, to search for her by name. Sleep came in short, uneasy fragments that night, broken again and again by the memory of Blackwood's booming voice, declaring that he would rather hope and lose than never hope at all. Isolde lay awake long after the fortress had gone quiet, staring at the cracked ceiling above her cot, turning the same question over and over in her mind, until it wore smooth and familiar, like a stone worried between fingers. If she stepped forward now, if she revealed the truth she had carried since childhood, would she be handing the resistance the hope it so desperately needed, or would she simply be handing Thorn's forces a target they could not miss? She rose before dawn, exhausted, but resolved to push the question aside, at least for now, and return to the ordinary rhythm of her duties, because the fortress did not pause its preparations, simply because one servant girl was wrestling with an impossible decision. Soldiers still needed to be fed, wounds still needed tending, water still needed carrying, from the well to the kitchens, bucket after bucket, the ache in her arms a strange comfort in its familiarity. It was mid-morning when she first noticed the calluses drawing unwanted attention. She was helping Peg sort through a delivery of dried meat that had arrived overnight, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, when one of the newly arrived officers, a lean man with sharp eyes named Ren Calder, paused beside the kitchen door and watched her work for a moment longer than seemed natural. Isolde did not notice him at first, focused entirely on separating the good cuts from the spoiled, but when she finally glanced up and caught his gaze, something in his expression made her pulse quicken. "You handle a blade before, girl?" he asked, nodding toward her hands as she set down the knife she had been using to trim the meat. Isolde forced a small, self-deprecating laugh, the kind she had practiced so many times over the years that it came almost without thought. "Only kitchen knives, sir. Enough to know which end to hold, though not much more than that." Ren's eyes lingered on her hands a moment longer, on the faint calluses along the base of her fingers that came from years of quiet, disciplined training with a real sword, training Marin had insisted upon even as she taught Isolde to scrub floors and disappear into crowds. It was training meant only for emergencies, Marin had always said, a skill to be hidden away like the crown itself, never displayed, never acknowledged, until the day it was truly needed. Strange, Ren said finally, though his tone remained light, almost teasing. You grip that knife like a soldier, not a cook. Perhaps I have simply spent too many years chopping vegetables, Isolde replied, keeping her voice easy even as her heart hammered against her ribs. It tends to build strength in unexpected places. Ren studied her for another long moment, before finally shrugging and moving on, apparently satisfied, or at least unwilling to press the matter further in the middle of a busy kitchen. Isolde returned to her work, but her hands trembled slightly as she resumed trimming the meat, and it took several minutes before she managed to steady herself again. It was not the first time someone had noticed something slightly wrong about her, some small detail that did not quite match the story she presented to the world. It had happened before, in other households, with other officers, other suspicious glances, that lasted a beat too long. She had always managed to deflect, to laugh it away, to bury the moment beneath ordinary explanations, until whoever had noticed simply forgot their initial curiosity and moved on with their lives. But something about the timing of this particular moment, so soon after the council meeting, so soon after the rumor of the lost crown had begun spreading through every corner of the fortress, made her uneasy, in a way she could not quite shake. She spent the rest of the day watching for Ren Calder's presence out of the corner of her eye, relieved each time she did not see him, though the relief never lasted long before the wariness crept back in. By evening, exhausted from a full day of work layered on top of a sleepless night, she found herself once again crossing paths with General Voss, this time in the fortress courtyard, where he stood alone near the outer wall, staring out toward the darkening horizon, where the enemy army continued its slow, inevitable approach. She had not intended to speak to him again so soon. She had told herself, repeatedly, that the safest course of action was to fade back into her usual invisibility, to give him no further reason to study her the way he had studied her in the map room. But something about the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man carrying more weight than he could easily bear, drew her forward, despite her better judgment. You should be inside, General, she said quietly, coming to stand a respectful distance away. The night air grows colder every evening now, and you have enough burdens without adding a fever to the list. Draven turned, and for a moment, surprise flickered across his face, before settling into something quieter, something almost grateful. Elsa, he said, using the false name she had given him days earlier, and the sound of it in his voice sent an odd, uncomfortable pang through her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. I did not expect company. I did not expect to offer it, she admitted. But you looked as though you could use some, whether you wanted it or not. He allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one she had seen from him since she had first begun serving in his household. 3 days, he said, his gaze drifting back toward the darkening horizon. 3 days until an army large enough to end this resistance reaches these walls, and I still do not know if the men I command are enough to hold them back. You have held them back before, Isolde said, against odds that seemed just as impossible. I have been fortunate before, he corrected gently. Fortune is not the same as strength, and I fear it may finally be running out. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had grown softer, more contemplative. Do you know what General Blackwood proposed at last night's council? Isolde's heart skipped, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. I only serve the water and clear the cups, General. I do not pretend to understand the strategies discussed at councils. He believes there may be truth to the rumor of the lost crown, Draven continued, apparently not noticing, or perhaps simply not caring, whether a servant girl was truly listening or not. He believes finding the rightful heir, if she still lives, could turn the tide of this entire war. I called it folklore once, in front of my own officers. I still do not know if I was wrong to do so. What do you believe now? Isolde asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Draven considered the question carefully, his pale gray eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the fortress walls. I believe, he said finally, that 4 years ago, I would have dismissed the very idea without a second thought. But 4 years of watching good men die, watching villages burn, watching this resistance grow more desperate with every passing season, has taught me that sometimes the only thing standing between hope and despair is a story people are willing to believe in. Whether the crown is real or not may matter less than whether the people believe it is. Isolde said nothing for a long moment, watching the wind stir the dark fields beyond the fortress walls, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a second skin. And if the crown were real, she asked carefully, and if the heir revealed herself, what would you do? Draven turned to look at her then, his expression unreadable in the fading light. I would fight beside her, he said simply. Whoever she was, wherever she came from, if she was willing to risk everything to stand for this kingdom, I would owe her nothing less than my sword and my loyalty. The words settled over Isolde with an intensity she had not expected, and for a moment, standing in the darkening courtyard beside a man who did not know her true name, she felt the strange, dizzying pull of a truth she had kept buried for 16 years, straining against the walls she had built to contain it. That is a generous promise, she managed finally, her voice steadier than she felt, for a woman who may not even exist. Perhaps, Draven said, but I have found, in this war, that generous promises are sometimes the only currency worth spending. Everything else has already cost us so much. They stood together in silence for a while longer, the cold evening air settling around them, the distant sound of soldiers preparing for the coming battle drifting across the courtyard. Isolde knew she should excuse herself, should retreat to the safety of her ordinary duties before the conversation ventured any further into dangerous territory. But something kept her rooted in place, some quiet, aching part of her that had spent 16 years starved for a moment, exactly like this one. A moment where someone spoke of the lost heir, not as a legend or a strategy, but as a person worth fighting for. You should rest, General, she said finally, forcing herself to step back, to remember the careful distance she had maintained for so long. Whatever tomorrow brings, you will need your strength. Draven nodded, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary as she turned to leave. Thank you, Elsa, he said quietly, for the company, if nothing else. She walked away without looking back, though she could feel his gaze following her across the courtyard, and it was not until she had climbed the narrow stairs to the servants' quarters and closed the door behind her that she finally allowed herself to breathe freely again. She sat on the edge of her cot for a long time afterward, the wooden box beneath her, untouched but impossible to ignore, and thought about everything Draven had said, about generous promises and desperate hope, and the strange, aching honesty in his voice when he spoke of fighting beside a queen he did not even believe was real. It was well past midnight when she finally reached beneath her cot and pulled the box free, opening it carefully, and lifting the tarnished circlet into the pale moonlight filtering through her small window. She studied it for a long time, tracing the faded royal seal pressed into its surface, the same seal she had glimpsed days earlier on the corner of Draven's old map. Marin's voice echoed in her memory, steady and certain even after all these years. Wait until the moment finds you. You will know it when it comes. Isolde closed her eyes and thought of Corin's bright, hopeful face in the training yard, of Paran's burned hands trembling as he drank from a cup she held steady for him, of Blackwood's booming declaration that he would rather hope and lose than never hope at all, and of Draven's quiet, unwavering promise to fight beside a queen he had never even met. Perhaps, she thought, the moment had already arrived, and she had simply been too frightened to recognize it. She did not sleep again that night, not truly. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the fear that had always accompanied thoughts of revealing herself was joined by something new, something that felt almost like courage, small and uncertain but undeniably present, growing quietly in the space where hesitation had lived for so long. The following morning, word arrived that the enemy army had been sighted crossing the final ridge before the fortress, now only 2 days out instead of 3, moving faster than anyone had predicted. The fortress erupted into frantic, final preparations, every soldier and servant alike pressed into service to reinforce the walls, gather supplies, and ready themselves for what everyone now understood was coming, whether they were prepared for it or not. Isolde worked alongside the others, carrying stones to reinforce the outer wall, boiling water for the wounded who would surely follow whatever battle awaited them, her mind racing even as her hands remained steady, with practiced discipline. Somewhere in the chaos of preparation, she caught sight of Ren Calder again, watching her from across the courtyard with the same sharp, assessing eyes he had turned on her in the kitchen the day before, and she forced herself to keep her expression calm, her movements ordinary, even as unease coiled tighter in her stomach. 2 days, she thought, watching the distant horizon where dust from the approaching army had begun to rise faintly against the gray sky. 2 days until everything changed, one way or another, and she still did not know which choice she would make when the moment finally, undeniably arrived. Ren Calder found her again that afternoon, this time near the well in the lower courtyard, where she had gone to draw water for the wounded who were being gathered in the fortress infirmary in preparation for the battle everyone now knew was only 2 days away. He approached without hurry, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes studying her with the same unsettling attentiveness he had shown in the kitchen. "You work harder than most soldiers I have commanded," he said, watching her haul the heavy bucket up from the depths of the well without visible strain. "Where did you learn such strength, if not from a blade?" "From carrying water since I was old enough to walk, sir," Isolde replied evenly, setting the bucket down and reaching for another. "There is nothing mysterious about calluses earned from an honest day's labor." "Perhaps." Ren studied her a moment longer, his expression unreadable. "Forgive me. I have simply learned, over many years of service, that the most dangerous people in any war are rarely the ones who announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they are the ones content to remain quiet, unnoticed, until the moment finally calls for them to step forward." Isolde forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, though her pulse hammered beneath her calm exterior. "I am only a servant, sir. Whatever moment you imagine calling me forward, I fear you will be sorely disappointed." Ren's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "We shall see," he said, and turned to walk away, leaving Isolde standing alone by the well, with her heart pounding and her hands, despite everything, perfectly steady around the handle of the bucket. She did not know what to make of the exchange, whether it was simply the idle suspicion of a tired officer looking for something, anything, to occupy his mind before the coming battle, or whether it signaled something far more dangerous, a growing awareness that might, if left unchecked, lead him directly to the truth she had spent 16 years protecting. Either way, she resolved to be more careful, to fade further into the background of fortress life, until the immediate danger of the approaching army had either passed or overwhelmed them entirely. That resolve lasted only until evening, when she found herself once again drawn toward the map room, this time not by any deliberate choice, but by the simple necessity of delivering a fresh pitcher of water to the officers, still working late into the night, poring over troop placements and defensive strategies, as the enemy army drew ever closer. Draven stood at the head of the table, flanked now by Colonel Fenn and 2 other senior officers, his face drawn with the particular exhaustion of a man who had not truly rested in days. She set the pitcher down quietly and turned to leave, but Draven's voice stopped her before she reached the door. "Elsa," he said, and something in his tone made her pause. "A moment, if you would." She turned back, keeping her expression carefully neutral, even as Colonel Fenn and the other officers glanced toward her with mild curiosity. "General?" "You have been in this fortress for how long now?" Draven asked. "Nearly a year, General," she replied honestly, though the years before that, spent in other households, other hiding places, remained unspoken. "And before that?" Isolde hesitated for only a fraction of a second, long enough that she hoped it would pass unnoticed among tired men, focused on far weightier matters. "I served in a household near the eastern border, General, before it was burned. I came west, seeking work, and found my way here." Draven studied her for a moment longer, and she could not tell whether the question had been born of genuine curiosity, or something closer to the suspicion Ren Calder had shown her earlier that same day. "Colonel Fenn tells me you handled yourself well when the wounded arrived from Halden's outpost. Calm under pressure. Steady hands. That is not a common trait, even among trained soldiers." "I have simply had practice remaining calm, General," Isolde said carefully. "Servants who panic do not last long in households like this one." A faint smile touched the corner of Draven's mouth, though his eyes remained thoughtful, searching. "No," he agreed. "I suppose they do not." He paused, glancing briefly at the map spread across the table, before returning his attention to her. "Thank you, Elsa. That will be all." She nodded, and left the room as quickly as propriety allowed, her heart pounding, as she made her way back toward the kitchens. It was the second time in as many days that someone within the fortress had looked at her too closely, asked questions that skirted dangerously near the truth she had spent so long protecting. And though neither Ren Calder nor Draven himself had said anything that could be considered a direct accusation, the accumulation of small, careful glances left her feeling exposed in a way she had not experienced in years. She spent the remainder of the evening helping Peg prepare what supplies could be gathered for the coming battle, her hands busy even as her mind continued to circle the same unanswered questions. Somewhere beyond the fortress walls, an army continued its relentless approach, close enough now that scouts reported seeing the faint glow of their campfires against the night sky from the highest watchtower. Somewhere within the fortress itself, the rumor of the lost crown continued to spread among soldiers and servants alike, growing larger and more urgent with each retelling. And somewhere inside herself, Isolde could feel the careful walls she had built over 16 years beginning to show their first true cracks, not from any single moment of discovery, but from the slow, steady accumulation of glances held a beat too long, questions asked a shade too pointedly, and a growing, undeniable sense that the world around her was closing in, whether she was ready for it or not. She climbed the stairs to the servants' quarters long after midnight, exhausted but unable to quiet the racing thoughts that kept sleep at bay. She lay on her cot staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling above her, listening to the distant sounds of a fortress bracing itself for war, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely uncertain which frightened her more. The possibility that Thorn's army would arrive before she was ready to act, or the growing, undeniable certainty that the choice she had spent 12 years avoiding was no longer entirely hers to postpone. Draven could not stop thinking about the servant girl named Elsa, and the realization troubled him more than he cared to admit. He sat alone in the map room long after the other officers had retired for what little rest remained before the enemy army arrived, staring at the same worn parchment he had studied a dozen times already that week, though his eyes kept drifting toward the doorway she had passed through hours earlier. It was not simply her calluses, though Colonel Fenn's offhand observation about her steady hands had lodged itself firmly in his mind. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence beneath her deference, the sharp intelligence that flickered behind her eyes whenever she believed no one was watching closely enough to notice. Servants in his experience were either broken by hardship into quiet obedience, or hardened by it into bitterness. Elsa was neither. She moved through the fortress with the composed self-possession of someone who had been taught, deliberately and carefully, how to disappear. He had seen that particular skill before, though it took him the better part of an hour, sitting alone with his exhausted thoughts, to remember exactly where. Years earlier, before Thorn's coup, before the palace burned and the world he had known collapsed into war, his own family had employed guards, trained specifically in the art of remaining unnoticed, of blending into crowds and rooms and conversations, so completely that even trained observers often failed to register their presence until it was too late. It was not a skill common people simply stumbled into by accident. It was taught, deliberately, by someone who understood its value. Who, he wondered, would have taught such a skill to a servant girl? He rose from the table and paced the length of the room, turning the puzzle over in his mind the way he might have studied a difficult battle strategy. Elsa claimed to have come from the eastern border, from a household burned in the fighting. It was a common enough story, one shared by thousands of displaced people across the kingdom since the war began. There was nothing inherently suspicious about it. And yet, something about the careful way she had answered his questions earlier that evening, the fraction of a second's hesitation before she spoke, nagged at him in a way he could not fully shake. He thought, too, of the rumor Blackwood had raised at the council meeting, of the lost heir, who might still walk somewhere among them, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself. He had dismissed the idea then, had called it folklore in front of his own officers, but standing alone in the quiet map room, exhaustion loosening the careful discipline he usually maintained over his thoughts, he found himself wondering, however briefly, whether the answer to Blackwood's search might be closer than any of them realized. It was an absurd thought, he told himself firmly, the kind of wishful thinking that desperate men indulged in when reality grew too heavy to bear, without some fragile hope to cling to. And yet the thought remained, quiet and persistent, refusing to be dismissed entirely. He decided, finally, that he would watch her more closely in the days ahead. Not out of suspicion exactly, but out of the same careful attentiveness he applied to every unresolved detail in his command. If there was nothing more to discover, he would find nothing, and the matter would settle itself naturally. But if there was something more, something hidden beneath the quiet, careful surface she presented to the world, he intended to understand it before the coming battle forced every secret in the fortress into the open, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The following morning arrived gray and heavy, with the promise of the battle that now loomed only a single day away. Scouts confirmed that Thorne's army had made camp on the northern plain, close enough that their numbers could be seen with the naked eye from the fortress's highest tower, an unbroken sea of tents and banners, stretching further than seemed possible for a single force to command. The fortress itself buzzed with the particular controlled chaos of final preparations, every soldier checking weapons one last time, every servant pressed into service carrying supplies to the walls, tending to nervous recruits, and preparing the infirmary for what everyone understood would be a difficult day ahead. Isolde worked through the morning with the same careful discipline she always maintained, though the weight of the coming battle pressed heavily against her thoughts. She carried bandages and clean water to the infirmary, helped reinforce the fortress gates alongside a team of exhausted soldiers, and found herself, more than once, glancing toward the training yard, where Corin and the other young recruits practiced their final drills before the enemy arrived, their faces pale with a fear they were trying desperately not to show. She found Draven near midday, standing at the fortress's outer wall, studying the distant enemy encampment through a battered spyglass, his expression unreadable. She approached carefully, carrying a small bundle of fresh bandages meant for the wall's forward watchpost, and paused a respectful distance away, unwilling to interrupt whatever grim calculations occupied his thoughts. "They outnumber us 3-1, perhaps more," he said finally, without lowering the spyglass, apparently aware of her presence, despite not turning to look at her. "Blackwood's forces will not arrive in time to reinforce us before the first assault. We will have to hold this fortress with what we have." "You have held worse odds before," Isolde said quietly, echoing the words she had offered him days earlier in the courtyard. "I have been fortunate before," he replied, lowering the spyglass at last and turning to look at her directly, his pale gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken uncomfortably. "You keep telling me that, Elsa. I wonder sometimes if you believe it yourself, or if you simply say it because you think it is what I need to hear." Isolde held his gaze, unwilling to look away first, though every instinct urged her toward the safety of deference. "Perhaps both can be true," she said carefully. "I believe you have survived worse odds because I have watched you do it, in the months I have served here, and I say it because a commander who believes he has already lost tends to lead his men into exactly the defeat he fears." Something shifted in Draven's expression. A flicker of surprise quickly smoothed into something quieter, more thoughtful. "You speak with unusual confidence for a servant, Elsa," he said, though his tone carried no accusation, only genuine curiosity. "Perhaps I have simply spent enough time in this fortress to understand what its people need to hear," she replied, forcing a lightness into her voice that she did not entirely feel, "whether or not I have any right to say it." He studied her a moment longer, and for a heartbeat, Isolde feared he might press further, might ask the question she had been dreading since the first night his eyes lingered too long on her in the doorway of the map room. But instead, he simply nodded, a faint, tired smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Whatever you believe, and whatever right you think you have to say it, I find I am grateful for the words regardless." He turned back toward the distant enemy encampment, raising the spyglass once more. "Tomorrow will test every soldier and every servant within these walls, Elsa. I hope, whatever happens, that you remain somewhere safe." Isolde watched him for a long moment before finally excusing herself, the bandages still clutched in her arms, her thoughts a tangled knot of fear and something else, something warmer and more dangerous that she refused to examine too closely, while an army of thousands prepared to descend upon them within a single day. That evening, as the fortress settled into the tense, restless quiet that always preceded a coming battle, Isolde found herself once again in the small, abandoned chapel, kneeling before the bare altar as she had done days earlier, the wooden box containing the crown clutched tightly in her hands. She had brought it with her this time, unwilling to leave it hidden beneath her cot, while the fortress braced for an attack that might, by tomorrow's end, leave the servants' quarters in ruins. She closed her eyes and thought of Marin's steady voice, of the promise she had made, as a frightened child hiding beneath a floorboard, while her family's home burned around her. Wait until the moment finds you. Tomorrow, an army would arrive at the fortress gates, and no matter what she chose to do, no matter how carefully she continued to hide, the battle that followed would not care whether she was ready for it or not. Perhaps, she thought, kneeling alone in the flickering candlelight, the moment Marin had promised was no longer something she needed to wait for. Perhaps it had simply arrived, disguised as an army on the horizon, and it was asking her, at last, to decide who she truly intended to be when the fortress gates finally gave way. She was not alone in the chapel for long. The soft creak of the wooden door drew her attention, and she quickly slid the box beneath the folds of her skirt, her heart pounding as she turned to see who had entered. It was Peg, her round face drawn with worry, a lit candle in one hand. "There you are," the older woman said, relief evident in her voice. "I have been looking for you everywhere. The infirmary needs more hands before dark, and I did not want you wandering the fortress alone tonight, of all nights." She paused, studying Isolde's expression in the candlelight, her brow furrowing with concern. "Are you well, girl? You look as though you have seen a ghost." "I am only tired," Isolde said, rising and smoothing her skirt carefully over the hidden box. "Tomorrow weighs heavily on all of us, I think." Peg's expression softened, and she reached out to squeeze Isolde's hand briefly, a small gesture of comfort that caught Isolde off guard with its unexpected warmth. "It weighs on all of us," Peg agreed, "but we will get through it together, the way we always have. Come now, the infirmary will not stock itself." Isolde followed her out of the chapel, grateful for the interruption despite herself, grateful for the simple, ordinary demand of duty that gave her hands something to do besides tremble with the weight of an unmade decision. She spent the remainder of the evening helping prepare the infirmary, folding bandages, boiling water, arranging cots in neat rows that she knew, with a heavy certainty, would soon be filled with wounded and dying men. Corin found her there sometime after dark, his young face pale beneath a layer of dust from the training yard, his hands trembling slightly as he helped carry a stack of clean linens. "Do you think we will hold them?" he asked quietly, his voice stripped of the bravado he usually wore like armor around the other recruits. Isolde set down the linens she was carrying and turned to face him fully, recognizing the particular fear in his eyes, the fear of someone facing his first true battle and uncertain whether he would survive to see its end. "I think," she said carefully, "that fear does not mean you are weak, Corin. It means you understand exactly what tomorrow will ask of you. The soldiers who survive are not the ones who feel no fear. They are the ones who feel it and stand their ground regardless." Corin nodded slowly, though his hands still trembled as he set down his own stack of linens. "My mother used to say something similar," he admitted. "Before the raiders burned our village, she said courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Isolde said softly, thinking, unbidden, of Marin, and the countless lessons she had woven into ordinary conversations over the years, lessons about courage and duty, and the terrible, necessary weight of difficult choices. "She would have liked you," Corin said, offering her a small, tired smile before returning to his work. "You remind me of her. A little. The way you always seem to know exactly what to say." Isolde watched him go, her chest tight with an emotion she could not fully name, and found herself, once again, circling back to the same unanswered question that had followed her through every conversation, every quiet moment, every glance held a beat too long over the past several days. Tomorrow, an army would arrive at the fortress gates. Tomorrow, young men like Corin would face a battle that might cost them everything, armed with nothing more than borrowed courage and the fragile hope that their cause was worth the sacrifice. She thought of the crown hidden beneath her skirt, tarnished and unremarkable to anyone who did not know its true meaning, and wondered, not for the first time, whether the weight of hope it might offer was worth the danger of revealing it, before she was fully certain the moment had truly arrived. She did not have an answer, not yet, but as she finished her work in the infirmary and made her way back toward the servants' quarters, through the darkened, tense corridors of the fortress, she understood, with a clarity that had been building for days, that whatever choice she ultimately made, it would not wait much longer to be decided. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not, and somewhere beneath the careful walls she had built over 16 years of hiding, a decision was already quietly, irreversibly, taking shape. The horns sounded before the sun had fully risen, 3 sharp blasts echoing across the fortress walls that sent every soldier scrambling toward their assigned positions. Isolde woke instantly, her heart already pounding before her mind had fully caught up with the reason why, and within moments, the servants' quarters had erupted into frantic motion, girls dressing quickly and grabbing whatever supplies they had been assigned to carry to the walls in the infirmary. She reached beneath her cot and pulled out the wooden box without hesitation this time, tucking it securely into the deep pocket, sewn into the inner lining of her skirt, a hiding place Marin had taught her to create years earlier, specifically for moments exactly like this one. She would not leave the crown behind, not today, not while chaos threatened to tear through every corner of the fortress and scatter its contents to danger she could not predict. The courtyard was already alive with movement by the time she reached it, soldiers rushing toward the walls with weapons drawn, officers shouting orders that were nearly swallowed by the growing roar of distant horns and drums from beyond the fortress gates. Isolde pressed herself against the flow of the crowd, making her way toward the infirmary, where Peg and the healer, a stern, capable woman named Ellen, were already preparing for the wounded, who would soon begin arriving in numbers none of them wanted to imagine. From the fortress's highest tower, the enemy army looked like a living thing, a vast, dark tide, rolling steadily across the northern plain toward the walls, banners, bearing Thorn's crest, snapping in the cold morning wind. Isolde caught only a brief glimpse of it through a narrow window as she hurried past, enough to feel her stomach twist with a fear so absolute it nearly stole the breath from her lungs, before she forced herself to keep moving, keep working, because the alternative was to stand frozen while the world came apart around her. The first assault struck the eastern wall within the hour, a thunderous impact of catapult fire that shook the entire fortress and sent a spray of stone and dust raining down into the courtyard below. Isolde ducked instinctively, shielding a stack of bandages with her body, as debris scattered across the infirmary floor, her ears ringing from the force of the blast. Around her, soldiers shouted orders, healers braced themselves for the wounded, and somewhere beyond the walls, the enemy army continued its relentless advance. The wounded began arriving within minutes, carried on makeshift stretchers by exhausted, blood-streaked soldiers, their injuries ranging from minor cuts to wounds so severe that Isolde had to force herself not to look away, as Ellen worked with brisk, practiced efficiency to stem the bleeding. She fell into the rhythm of the work almost instantly, holding wounded men steady, while Ellen stitched gashes closed, fetching clean water and fresh bandages, offering quiet, steady words of comfort to frightened soldiers, who gripped her hands, as though her calm presence alone might hold them together. "You are doing well," Ellen told her during a brief lull, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of one blood-streaked hand. "Most girls your age would have fainted by now." "I do not have the luxury of fainting," Isolde replied, tying off a bandage on a young soldier's arm with quick, sure fingers. "Not today." The battle raged on outside the infirmary walls, the sounds of clashing steel and shouted commands filtering through even the fortress's thick stone, a constant, terrifying reminder of how close the enemy had already come. Isolde worked without pause through the morning and into the afternoon, her hands growing stiff with dried blood, her mind narrowing to the single, urgent task in front of her at any given moment, until finally, in a rare moment of quiet between waves of wounded, a soldier arrived at the infirmary door, with news that sent a fresh wave of dread through the crowded room. "The western gate has been breached," he gasped, blood streaming from a shallow cut above his eye. "General Voss is leading a counterattack to hold the courtyard. We need every able body who can hold a weapon." Isolde's blood ran cold at the words, her thoughts immediately flying to Draven, to the exhausted, determined man who had stood beside her at the fortress wall, only the day before, promising to fight beside a queen he did not even believe existed. She thought of the crown hidden in her pocket, of the promise Marin had extracted from her so many years ago, and of the terrible, undeniable knowledge that if the western gate had truly fallen, the fortress itself might not survive the day. Ellen caught her arm before she could move toward the door, her expression sharp with warning. "Do not even think of running toward that fighting girl. We need you here, not lying wounded on the courtyard stones." Isolde forced herself to nod, forced herself to remain in the infirmary, as more wounded streamed through the door, though every instinct screamed at her to do something more than simply bandage wounds, while the fortress's fate hung in the balance beyond the walls. She worked through her fear with grim determination, her hands steady even as her heart hammered with a terror she refused to let show on her face, and it was nearly an hour later, as the light outside began to shift toward late afternoon, that word finally arrived that the western gate had been held, that Draven's counterattack had pushed the enemy back through sheer, desperate force of will. The relief that swept through the infirmary was immediate and profound, though it was tempered by the grim reality of the wounded still filling every available cot, and the knowledge that the enemy army, though pushed back for now, remained camped just beyond the fortress walls, still vastly outnumbering the exhausted defenders within. Draven himself appeared in the infirmary doorway sometime after dusk, his armor dented and blood-stained, a shallow cut across one cheekbone that had not yet been properly tended. Isolde's breath caught at the sight of him, relief and lingering fear warring in her chest as she moved quickly toward him, gesturing for him to sit on an empty stool near the entrance. "You are bleeding, General," she said, reaching for clean cloth and water before he could protest. "Sit. Let me tend to that before it worsens." "It is only a scratch," Draven said, though he did not resist as she began carefully cleaning the wound, his exhaustion evident in the way he allowed himself, for once, to simply sit still and be cared for. "We held the gate, barely, but we held it." "At what cost?" Isolde asked quietly, glancing around the crowded infirmary at the rows of wounded soldiers. "Too high a cost," Draven admitted, his voice rough with fatigue and something that sounded almost like grief, but a cost we could still afford to pay, unlike the alternative. He was quiet for a moment as she finished cleaning the wound and began applying a bandage, his pale gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite the exhaustion weighing down every part of her. "You have blood on your hands, Elsa. Not your own, I hope." "Not my own," she confirmed, tying off the bandage with careful, practiced fingers, "though I fear a great deal of it belongs to men I have come to care for over these past months." Draven nodded slowly, his expression softening into something that looked almost like gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for today. For all of it." "You do not need to thank me for doing my duty, General," Isolde replied, though something in his tone made the words feel inadequate, incomplete somehow. "Perhaps not," he said. "But I find myself wanting to regardless." He rose slowly from the stool, wincing slightly as the movement pulled against his freshly bandaged wound. "Tomorrow, they will likely try again. Harder this time. We held the gate today, but I do not know how many more days like this one we can survive." Isolde watched him go, weaving carefully through the crowded infirmary toward the courtyard beyond, and felt, for the first time since the horns had first sounded that morning, the full weight of exactly how close they had all come to losing everything. She thought again of the crown hidden in her pocket, of the promise she had carried for 12 long years, and of the terrible, growing certainty that whatever moment Marin had spoken of, whatever sign she had promised would arrive, it could not possibly wait much longer without the resistance itself running out of time to survive. The infirmary remained busy long into the night, and it was well past midnight before Isolde finally found a few stolen moments to rest, sitting alone in a quiet corner of the courtyard, beneath a sky littered with cold, distant stars, her hands still faintly stained with blood despite repeated washing. She pulled the wooden box from her pocket and held it against her chest, listening to the exhausted quiet of a fortress that had survived, against terrible odds, one more day. Tomorrow, the enemy would likely attack again. And somewhere in the space between exhaustion and fear, Isolde understood, with a clarity sharper than any she had felt before, that the resistance could not survive many more days like this one, without something more than borrowed courage and desperate counterattacks to sustain it. They needed hope. They needed a reason to believe that this terrible, grinding war might still, somehow, be won. She closed her eyes, gripping the box tightly, and for the first time in 16 years, allowed herself to imagine, fully and without immediately retreating from the thought, what it might mean to finally reveal the truth she had carried for so long. She did not remain alone for long. Peg found her sitting in the shadowed corner of the courtyard, and without a word, settled down beside her with a groan, rubbing at the ache in her lower back from a long day spent hauling water and supplies between the infirmary and the kitchens. You look like a woman carrying the weight of the whole fortress on her shoulders, Peg said, glancing sideways at her with the particular perceptiveness she usually reserved for judging whether bread had risen properly. We survived today. That is more than many expected, myself included, if I am being honest. We survived today, Isolde agreed quietly. But tomorrow will come regardless of whether we are ready for it. Peg was silent for a moment, studying the stars scattered across the cold night sky. My husband used to say something similar, before the fighting took him 3 years back, she said finally, her voice softer than Isolde had ever heard it. He said worrying about tomorrow's battle before it arrived only stole strength you would need once it did. Rest while you can, he always told me. The fighting will wait for no one, but neither should your sleep wait for the fighting. He sounds like he was a wise man, Isolde said gently. He was a stubborn man, Peg corrected, a faint smile touching her tired face. But wise, sometimes, despite himself. She pushed herself up from the ground with a small groan, extending a hand to help Isolde rise as well. Come, whatever weight you are carrying tonight, it will still be there in the morning. For now, we both need what little rest this fortress can spare us. Isolde allowed herself to be pulled to her feet, grateful, despite everything, for the older woman's rough, unwavering kindness. They walked together toward the servants' quarters in companionable silence, past soldiers standing exhausted watch along the fortress walls, past the infirmary where a few remaining lanterns still burned low, as Ellen tended to the last of the night's wounded, past the quiet, empty training yard, where Corin and the other young recruits had fought their first true battle, only hours earlier, and, by some fortune, Isolde refused to take for granted, survived it. She found Corin waiting near the entrance to the servants' quarters, sitting alone on an overturned crate, his young face pale and streaked with dust, a fresh bandage wrapped around his forearm. He looked up as she approached, and the relief in his expression at seeing her unharmed was so raw and immediate that it caught in her chest like a physical ache. "You are well," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion, and something that sounded very much like unshed tears. "I heard the infirmary was overwhelmed. I feared." He stopped, unable to finish the thought. "I am well," Isolde confirmed gently, sitting down beside him on the crate. "And you survived your first true battle. That is no small thing, Corin." "I killed a man today," he said quietly, staring down at his trembling hands. "I did not think it would feel the way it did. I thought, if it ever happened, I would feel something like triumph. Instead, I only feel sick." Isolde reached out and took his hand gently, remembering, with painful clarity, her own first understanding of what war truly cost, learned far too young in the smoking ruins of her family's home. "That sickness means you are still human, Corin," she said softly. "The day it stops feeling that way is the day you should worry. War asks terrible things of good people. It does not make you less good for feeling the weight of what it asks." Corin nodded slowly, though his hands continued to tremble, and Isolde sat with him in silence for a long while, offering the only comfort she truly had to give, the simple, steady presence of someone who understood, without needing further explanation, exactly what he was carrying. It was well past midnight before he finally rose, thanking her quietly, and made his way toward the barracks, where the other recruits had already collapsed into exhausted sleep. Isolde remained a moment longer in the quiet courtyard, watching him go, before finally climbing the narrow stairs toward her own small chamber. She lay on her cot fully clothed, too exhausted and too unsettled to properly prepare for sleep, the wooden box still clutched against her chest, and stared up at the familiar cracks in the ceiling above her, listening to the fortress finally settle into an uneasy, temporary peace around her. Tomorrow, the enemy would likely attack again, harder and with greater numbers than the assault they had barely survived that day. Tomorrow, more soldiers like Corin would face the terrible weight of battle, and more wounded would fill Ellen's infirmary, and the fortress would once again teeter on the narrow edge between survival and collapse. Isolde thought of Draven's exhausted gratitude in the infirmary, of his quiet promise days earlier, to fight beside a queen he did not believe existed, and of the growing, undeniable certainty, settling deep within her, that the resistance could not continue absorbing losses like today's for much longer, without something more than desperate courage to sustain it. She fell, finally, into a restless, dreamless sleep sometime near dawn, the box still held tightly against her chest, the weight of an unmade decision pressing down on her even in the brief hours of rest the exhausted fortress allowed her. 3 days after the first assault on the western gate, the fortress had settled into a grim, uneasy rhythm of survival, each day beginning with the fear of renewed attack and ending with quiet, exhausted relief that the walls had held for one more night. Thorne's army had not pressed forward with the same overwhelming force as their initial assault, choosing instead to lay siege, tightening a slow, patient grip around the fortress that many of the officers found even more unsettling than open battle. A siege meant time, and time, Draven knew, favored the larger army, the one with deeper stores of grain and fresh water and reinforcements waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. It was during this uneasy lull that Colonel Fenn arrived at the map room, carrying an old, dust-covered chest that had been recovered from the fortress's lower archive, a storage room rarely visited, except by those searching for supply records or outdated maps. He set the chest down on the table with a heavy thud, his expression carrying the particular excitement of a man who believed he had found something important. "You asked me to search the old resistance records for anything related to the royal bloodline," Fenn said, lifting the lid of the chest to reveal a jumble of yellowed papers, cracked wax seals, and faded ink. "Most of it is nothing. Supply requisitions and troop movements from years ago. But I found this tucked among the older letters, and I think you will want to see it." He handed Draven a single folded letter, its paper brittle with age, the ink faded but still legible. Draven unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the careful, precise handwriting that filled the page, and felt something in his chest tighten as he read. The letter was written by a woman named Marin, addressed to an unnamed recipient within the resistance, dated only months after the palace fell 16 years earlier. It spoke, in careful, guarded language, of a child rescued from the burning palace on the night of the coup, a child of royal blood who had survived when so many others had not. It spoke of a promise to protect this child, to raise her in secret, to teach her patience and discipline until the day the kingdom was ready to receive her. And then, near the bottom of the page, a single line that made Draven's breath catch entirely. "She is placed somewhere close, hidden in plain sight, serving those who would one day need her most. When the moment comes, she will know it, and so, I hope, will you." Draven read the letter 3 times before finally lowering it, his mind racing through every interaction he had shared with the quiet, composed servant girl, who had occupied his thoughts far more than he had been willing to admit these past several weeks, serving those who would one day need her most. He thought of Elsa's steady hands, her calluses that did not match a life spent scrubbing floors, her careful, guarded answers whenever he asked about her past, the strange, unshakable sense he had carried since their first real conversation that there was something more beneath her quiet deference than she allowed anyone to see. "Where did this letter come from?" he asked Fenn, his voice tighter than he intended. "It was among the papers transferred here when the Eastern Archive was evacuated 3 years ago, before that region fell to Thorne's forces," Fenn replied. "I do not know who this Marin was, or who she was writing to. But if the letter is genuine, and if the child she speaks of is still alive somewhere within the resistance, then Blackwood's rumor may not be a rumor at all," Draven finished quietly, staring down at the letter as though it might yield further secrets simply from the intensity of his attention. He spent the remainder of the afternoon locked in the map room, the letter spread before him alongside every scrap of information he could gather about the fortress's servants, cross-referencing arrival dates, places of origin, anything that might narrow the search for a woman who had spent 16 years being deliberately, expertly hidden. But the more he searched, the more he found his thoughts circling back, again and again, to a single name. Elsa had arrived at the fortress nearly a year earlier, claiming to have come from a household near the eastern border, the very region from which the archive containing Marin's letter had been evacuated. She carried herself with a discipline and composure that did not match the story she told about her past. She moved through the fortress with the particular, practiced skill of someone taught to be unnoticed, a skill that servants born to hardship rarely possessed in such refined form. And when he had asked her, only days earlier, what she believed about the lost heir, she had answered not with dismissal, but with a careful, thoughtful consideration that suggested she understood the question far more intimately than a simple servant reasonably should. He sat back in his chair, the letter still clutched in one hand, and allowed himself, for the first time, to fully consider the possibility that had been circling the edges of his mind for days. It seemed impossible, and yet the more he examined the evidence gathered before him, the less impossible it felt. Colonel Fenn watched him carefully from across the table, apparently recognizing the direction of his thoughts. "You suspect someone specific," he said. "Not quite a question." "I do not know yet," Draven admitted, though even as he spoke the words, he understood they were not entirely true. "But I intend to find out, carefully, before I say anything that cannot be unsaid." He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, close to his chest, and sat for a long while in the quiet map room after Fenn had departed, turning the pieces of the puzzle over in his mind, again and again, until the pale gray eyes and steady hands of the servant girl he had come to trust more than he expected settled, finally and completely, into a shape he could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Outside, beyond the fortress walls, the siege continued its slow, patient grip, and somewhere within the fortress itself, a servant girl carried on with her ordinary duties, unaware that the careful walls she had maintained for 16 years had just begun, quietly and irrevocably, to crumble. That evening, Draven found himself watching Elsa with a new, careful attentiveness as she moved through the great hall, delivering meals to the officers who remained gathered around the map table, discussing the slow, grinding realities of the siege. He noticed, in a way he had not fully allowed himself to notice before, the quiet grace of her movements, the way she seemed to read the room instinctively, refilling cups before they were empty, clearing plates the moment they were finished, all while remaining so unobtrusive that most of the officers barely acknowledged her presence at all. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of skill a royal attendant might have once been trained to master, the art of anticipating needs before they were spoken, of moving through a room of powerful people without ever drawing attention to oneself. He had seen it before, in the palace of his childhood, in the careful, practiced movements of servants who had spent years perfecting the delicate balance between visibility and invisibility. He caught her eye once, briefly, as she refilled his own cup, and something in her expression flickered, a fraction of a second of wariness, quickly smoothed back into calm deference. He wondered, watching her retreat back toward the shadows along the wall, whether she had noticed him watching, whether some instinct honed over years of careful hiding had already sensed the shift in his attention. He did not confront her that night. He told himself it was because the timing was wrong, because the fortress could not afford the disruption of a revelation that might prove false, because Colonel Fenn's letter, however compelling, remained only a piece of circumstantial evidence rather than definitive proof. But some quieter, more honest part of him understood that he was also, simply, afraid of what he might learn, and more than that, afraid of what it might mean if he was right. He spent the following days observing her more closely, cataloging small details he had previously dismissed or overlooked entirely. The way she sometimes corrected the grammar of frightened recruits without seeming to notice she had done it, a habit that suggested an education far beyond what most servants received. The way she moved with perfect balance even while carrying heavy loads, her posture never faltering under weight that left other servants stumbling. The way, once, he had glimpsed her sitting alone in the abandoned chapel, her lips moving in what looked, from a distance, less like simple prayer, and more like the recitation of something memorized long ago. He said nothing to Colonel Fenn about his growing certainty, though he suspected Fenn had already reached similar conclusions of his own. He said nothing to Blackwood, whose riders continued their fruitless search across the southern provinces for any trace of the heir the rumor spoke of, unaware that she might already be standing quietly among them, refilling cups and mending torn uniforms in a fortress under siege. Instead, he waited, watching, weighing the letter against every observation, until one evening, nearly a week after the letter's discovery, he found himself alone with her again in the map room, the way he had been so many times before, except now every word she spoke, every small gesture, carried a weight it had not carried previously. "You seem distracted tonight, General," Isolde observed, setting a plate of simple bread and cheese on the corner of the table, unaware of the careful scrutiny beneath his tired expression. "Is there news from the siege lines?" "Nothing new," Draven said, watching her carefully. "Though I confess my thoughts have been elsewhere this evening." "Something troubling you?" she asked, and he noted, with a strange mixture of admiration and sorrow, How effortlessly she maintained the easy, natural rhythm of their conversation, giving no indication of the careful walls he now suspected lay beneath it. "I found an old letter today," he said carefully, watching for any change in her expression. "Written by a woman named Marin, many years ago. Do you know the name?" For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across Isolde's face. So brief he might have missed it entirely, had he not been watching so closely. A flash of something raw and unguarded, before the careful mask slid back into place. "I do not believe so, General," she said, her voice perfectly even. "Should I?" "Perhaps not," Draven said quietly, though his heart was pounding now, with a certainty he could no longer deny. "It was only a passing thought. Forgive me for asking." She nodded and excused herself shortly after, and Draven remained alone in the map room, long after she had gone, staring at the closed door through which she had disappeared, the letter still folded carefully in his coat pocket, his mind turning over the small, unmistakable flicker of recognition he had glimpsed in her eyes, before she had so quickly and skillfully buried it away. He did not yet know how, or when, he would raise the question directly, or what it would mean for the fortress, for the resistance, for the war itself, if his suspicions proved true. But he understood, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that the moment for careful, quiet observation was drawing rapidly to a close, and that whatever truth Elsa had spent so long protecting, it would not remain hidden for very much longer. Isolde could not sleep after leaving the map room that evening. She lay on her cot, replaying the conversation again and again in her mind, the careful, deliberate way Draven had spoken Marin's name, watching her reaction, with an intensity that had nothing to do with idle curiosity. She had recovered quickly, she told herself, had given nothing away beyond that single, unavoidable flash of recognition, before she could stop it. But she knew, with a sinking certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, that Draven was no longer simply a general, distracted by the pressures of a siege. He was a man, closing in on a truth she had spent 16 years protecting. She rose before dawn, exhausted and unsettled, and went through the motions of her ordinary duties with a distracted heaviness she could not fully shake. She kept expecting, all through the long, tense day, to be summoned before Draven and questioned directly, to have the careful walls of her hidden identity torn down in front of the entire fortress. But the summons did not come, not that day, nor the day that followed, and the waiting itself became its own particular torment, stretching her nerves thinner with each passing hour of uncertain silence. It was on the third evening after their conversation in the map room that Draven finally sought her out directly, finding her alone in the small, quiet chapel where she had taken to spending her rare private moments, kneeling before the bare altar with the wooden box clutched in her hands. She heard the door creak open behind her and turned, expecting Peg, or perhaps one of the other servants, and felt her heart stop entirely at the sight of Draven standing in the doorway, his expression grave, a folded letter held in one hand. "Elsa," he said quietly, stepping into the chapel and closing the door behind him, with a soft, deliberate click that felt, in that moment, like the closing of every escape route she might have imagined. "Or perhaps I should ask you a different question first. Is that truly your name?" Isolde rose slowly from where she knelt, the wooden box still clutched tightly in her hands, her mind racing through a dozen possible responses, a dozen careful deflections she had practiced for exactly this moment, over 16 long years. But standing there in the flickering candlelight, facing a man who had fought beside her, trusted her, spoken openly of the promises he would make to a queen he believed might not even exist, she found, for the first time in her entire life, that she could not bring herself to lie. "No," she said quietly, the single word carrying the weight of 16 years of careful, exhausting deception. "It is not." Draven exhaled slowly, as though he had been holding his breath since the moment he first read Marin's letter, and unfolded the paper in his hand, holding it out toward her. "I found this among the old resistance archives," he said. "A letter, written by a woman named Marin, speaking of a royal child, rescued from the palace the night it burned. A child, placed somewhere close, hidden in plain sight, serving those who would one day need her most." He paused, his pale gray eyes fixed intently on her face. "I have watched you for days, Elsa. Your hands, your posture, the way you carry yourself through rooms full of powerful men, without ever truly being seen. I do not believe, any longer, that these are the habits of an ordinary servant girl. Isolde stared at the letter in his outstretched hand, recognizing, even from a distance, the careful, precise handwriting she had not seen in 12 years, since the night Marin had died, with that same steady hand pressed against Isolde's own, extracting a promise that had shaped every single day of her life since. Tears pricked unexpectedly at her eyes, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by the sudden, dizzying collision of grief and fear, and something that felt, impossibly, almost like relief. She wrote that letter to someone she trusted, hoping it might one day help me, Isolde said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I did not know it still existed. I thought it had been lost, or destroyed, along with everything else from that time. Draven lowered the letter slowly, his expression shifting from careful, guarded suspicion into something far more complicated, a mixture of shock and wonder, and a strange, aching tenderness that made Isolde's chest tighten painfully. Then it is true, he said quietly. You are the child Marin wrote of. The heir Blackwood has spent weeks searching for across 3 provinces. Isolde nodded slowly, and with trembling hands, she opened the wooden box she had carried for so long, lifting the tarnished circlet into the candlelight, for the first time in front of another living soul, beyond the ones who had raised her in secret. My name, she said quietly, is Isolde. I was 4 years old when the palace burned, when King Cassian Thorn murdered my family and declared the royal bloodline extinct. Marin was my nursemaid. She carried me out of the fire and raised me in hiding, moving from household to household, teaching me to disappear so completely that no one, not even the sharpest-eyed officer, would ever think to look twice at me. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on, unable to stop now that the truth had finally begun spilling free after so many years of careful containment. She made me promise to wait, to hide, until the kingdom was ready to fight for a queen, and not merely a cause. She said I would know the moment when it came. I have spent 12 years since her death wondering if that moment would ever arrive, or if I would simply carry this crown to my own quiet grave, the last, forgotten proof of a kingdom that no longer believed it needed saving. Draven stared at the circlet resting in her palms, the faded royal seal catching the candlelight, and slowly, deliberately, lowered himself to one knee before her, a gesture so unexpected and so profoundly earnest that Isolde felt her breath catch entirely. General, please, she said quickly, reaching toward him. You do not need to. I made a promise, days ago, standing on the fortress wall, Draven said, looking up at her, with an intensity that stole whatever protest she had intended to voice. I said that if the heir revealed herself, whoever she was, wherever she came from, I would offer her my sword and my loyalty without reservation. I did not know, when I spoke those words, that I was making that promise to a woman who had already spent months earning both, simply by tending wounds and offering steady words to frightened men, and speaking truths I needed to hear more than I realized. He rose slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. I meant what I said, Isolde. Whatever comes next, whatever this revelation costs us both, I stand with you. Isolde felt tears finally spill freely down her cheeks, 16 years of careful, guarded restraint breaking loose all at once, in the quiet, candlelit chapel. I am afraid, she admitted, the words raw and unguarded, in a way she had not allowed herself to be with anyone since Marin's death, not of the danger, though I understand it fully. I am afraid of becoming a symbol instead of a person. Afraid that the moment this crown is seen, I will cease to be Isolde, the girl who scrubbed your floors and bandaged your soldiers, and become instead only a name on a banner, a cause for men to die for, whether or not I am worthy of that sacrifice. Draven was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to every difficult decision. I cannot promise you that fear will not come true. In part, he said finally, honestly. A crown carries weight that no one can fully escape once it is claimed. But I can promise you this, whatever you become to the soldiers who rally behind you, to the people who will look to you for hope, you will not lose yourself entirely, not while I stand beside you. I have known Isolde these past months, quiet and steady and wiser than she ever let herself appear. I do not intend to let that woman disappear simply because the world finally learns her name. Isolde looked up at him, at the earnest, unwavering conviction in his pale gray eyes, and felt something shift deep within her, a fear that had lived in her chest for 16 years, easing, just slightly, in the face of his steady, unwavering promise. "The fortress is under siege," she said finally, wiping the tears from her cheeks with the back of one hand, forcing herself back toward practicality, even as her heart still raced from everything that had just passed between them. "Thorn's army surrounds us. Blackwood searches for me across 3 provinces while I stood among you all along. If I reveal myself now, what happens next? Do I simply walk into the war council and declare myself queen, in the middle of a siege that may yet cost us the fortress entirely?" "You do exactly that," Draven said, a faint, determined smile touching the corner of his mouth, for the first time since he had entered the chapel. "Blackwood believes hope alone could turn the tide of this war. He is wrong, in part. Hope alone wins nothing. But hope, joined to courage, joined to a symbol the people can rally behind, standing before them not as a legend, but as a living, breathing queen, who has bled alongside them, bandaged their wounds, and shared their fear through every dark night of this siege, that might be exactly what this resistance needs to survive what comes next." Isolde closed the wooden box carefully, holding it against her chest, and looked toward the small, high window of the chapel, where the faint glow of the enemy's siege fires still burned against the dark horizon beyond the fortress walls. Somewhere out there, an army waited, patient and merciless, for the fortress to finally fall. Somewhere within these walls, soldiers and servants alike continued their desperate, exhausted resistance, unaware that the answer to the rumor spreading through every corner of the kingdom had been standing quietly among them for nearly a year. "Then I suppose," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt, though something resolute had settled into it that had not been there before, "it is time I stopped hiding." They talked long into the night, seated together on the low wooden bench at the back of the chapel, the single candle burning steadily lower, as Isolde finally allowed herself to speak openly of everything she had carried in silence for so many years. She told him of the night the palace burned, fragments of memory that had never fully faded despite her young age at the time, the acrid smell of smoke, Marin's arms wrapped tightly around her as they fled through a servant's passage, while the sounds of fighting echoed through the halls behind them. She told him of the years that followed, moving from household to household under a series of careful, invented names, learning to read the old royal histories by candlelight while pretending, during the day, to know nothing beyond how to scrub a floor properly. Draven listened without interruption, his expression shifting through sorrow and admiration, and a quiet, growing anger, directed not at her, but at the terrible weight she had been forced to carry alone for so long. When she finally finished, the candle had burned down to little more than a stub, and the fortress beyond the chapel walls had settled into the deep, uneasy quiet that always preceded the darkest hours before dawn. "There is a danger I have not mentioned," Isolde said finally, her voice quieter now, more hesitant. "An officer within your own command, Ren Calder, has grown suspicious of me these past weeks. He has noticed the calluses on my hands, the way I hold myself. If he learns the truth before I am ready to reveal it on my own terms, I fear what he might do with that knowledge." Draven's jaw tightened at the name. "Calder has served under me for 2 years. He is thorough, and occasionally overly suspicious of everyone around him, but I have never known him to be disloyal." "Perhaps not disloyal," Isolde said carefully, "but ambitious men sometimes believe that being the one who uncovers a hidden queen carries its own kind of power, regardless of where their true loyalties lie. I do not wish to accuse him unfairly. I only wish to be careful." "Then we will be careful," Draven agreed, rising from the bench and extending a hand to help her to her feet. "But careful does not mean waiting indefinitely. The siege will not hold forever in our favor, and Blackwood's search grows more determined by the day. If Calder, or anyone else, uncovers the truth before you are ready to claim it yourself, the revelation will happen on someone else's terms, not yours. I would rather see you walk into that council hall as a queen who chose her own moment, than have the truth dragged out of the shadows by a suspicious officer looking to make a name for himself." Isolde nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in his words even as fear coiled tighter in her chest at the thought of what came next. "Then what do you propose?" "A council," Draven said, his voice taking on the familiar steady cadence of a commander formulating strategy. "Blackwood and Vance are both due to return within the week, to discuss the siege and reinforcements. If you are ready, that council would be the moment." Not a quiet confession in a private chapel, but a full revelation, before every general who has spent this war searching for exactly what you carry in that box. Let them see the crown. Let them see the woman who has served among us, tended our wounded, and carried this secret through every dark night of this siege without once faltering in her duty. Isolde closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the scene, the weight of every eye in that hall turning toward her, the crown resting on her brow for the first time since she was a small child too young to remember wearing it at all. Fear still lived in her chest, undeniable and heavy, but beneath it, something steadier had begun to take root, a resolve that had been building slowly since the moment she first watched Draven kneel before her in the candlelight, offering his sword and his loyalty without hesitation. "A week," she said finally, opening her eyes and meeting his steady gaze. "I will use that time to prepare myself, and you will help me watch for any sign that Calder, or anyone else, grows closer to the truth before then." "Agreed," Draven said, and something in the simple, quiet solemnity of the word felt, to Isolde, like the closing of one long chapter of her life, and the beginning of another, far more uncertain one. They parted ways near the chapel door, Draven returning to the map room to resume his endless work overseeing the siege's grinding defense. Isolde making her way back toward the servants' quarters through corridors grown quiet with the deep hours of night. She climbed the narrow stairs slowly, the wooden box clutched against her chest, and lay down on her cot without bothering to remove her dress, staring up at the familiar cracks in the ceiling above her, her mind racing with everything that had shifted in the span of a single evening. For 16 years, she had lived as a shadow, careful and unseen, protecting a secret that had shaped every choice she ever made. Tonight, for the first time, that secret had a witness, beyond the ones who had raised her, and somewhere in the quiet, exhausted hours before dawn, Isolde felt something she had not allowed herself to feel, in longer than she could remember. Not simply fear, though fear remained, constant and undeniable, but hope, fragile and new, taking root alongside it, whispering that perhaps the moment Marin had promised so long ago had finally, truly arrived. The days that followed passed differently than any Isolde had known before, filled with the same ordinary duties she had performed for months, carrying water, tending wounds, mending torn uniforms, but layered now beneath a quiet, constant awareness that everything was about to change. She continued her work in the infirmary each morning, sat with Corin during his rare moments of rest, exchanged brisk, familiar words with Peg in the kitchens, and through it all, carried the knowledge of what awaited her at the end of the week like a stone lodged deep in her chest, heavy and impossible to fully set aside. Draven found small ways to check on her throughout each day, brief exchanges in busy corridors, a shared glance across the great hall during meals, nothing that would draw undue attention, but enough that Isolde no longer felt entirely alone in carrying the weight of what was coming. He had grown, in the span of a single conversation in a candle-lit chapel, from a distant commander she quietly admired, into something closer to a partner in the difficult path that lay ahead, and the change unsettled her nearly as much as it comforted her, stirring feelings she had never permitted herself to fully examine during her long years of careful hiding. 3 days before the council was set to gather, she found herself once again drawing water from the well in the lower courtyard, and once again, Ren Calder approached, his sharp eyes studying her with the same unsettling attentiveness he had shown weeks earlier. This time, however, something in his expression had hardened into something closer to certainty. "I have been asking questions," he said without preamble, his voice low enough that it would not carry beyond the two of them. "About a household near the eastern border, the one you claim to have served before coming here. No such household exists in the records I have searched. No family matching your description was reported among the refugees who fled that region." Isolde kept her expression carefully neutral, though her pulse quickened beneath the calm surface. "Records are not always complete, sir, especially from regions overrun so early in the war." "Perhaps," Ren said, stepping closer, his voice dropping further. "Or perhaps you have simply been careful enough, all this time, to leave no trace of your true past for anyone to find. I do not know yet what you are hiding, girl, but I intend to find out, and when I do, I will decide for myself whether it belongs first to General Voss, or to someone who might reward such information more generously." The threat, veiled though it was, sent a cold jolt of fear through Isolde's chest, and for a moment, she considered simply telling him the truth then and there, revealing everything before he could carry his suspicions to someone far more dangerous than an ambitious officer. But she forced herself to remain steady, remembering Draven's counsel that the revelation must come on her own terms, not dragged into the open by threat or coercion. "You may search all you like, sir," she said finally, her voice remarkably steady, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "I have nothing to hide beyond an ordinary, difficult past that I do not care to revisit for idle curiosity." Ren studied her a moment longer, clearly unconvinced, before finally turning and walking away without another word. Isolde remained by the well, her hands trembling now that he could no longer see them, and forced herself to breathe slowly until the worst of the fear had passed. She found Draven that evening in the map room and relayed the exchange carefully, watching his expression darken with barely contained anger as she spoke. "He threatens to sell information to Thorn's forces," Draven said, his voice tight with restrained fury. "That is not ambition, Isolde. That is treason, and I will not allow it to endanger you before the council has even gathered." "What will you do?" she asked, alarm rising at the thought of any confrontation that might draw further attention before she was ready. "I will have him watched, closely, by men I trust completely," Draven said, already turning toward the door. "And if he takes even a single step toward betraying this fortress, he will answer for it before he ever has the chance to reach Thorn's camp." True to his word, Draven assigned 2 of his most trusted soldiers to quietly monitor Ren Calder's movements over the following days, and though the tension of the threat never fully faded from Isolde's thoughts, she found herself, slowly, settling into the strange, unfamiliar rhythm of preparing not simply to survive each day, but to step forward, at last, into the role she had spent 16 years avoiding. She spent her rare, quiet moments practicing, in the privacy of the abandoned chapel, the careful bearing Marin had taught her so long ago, the particular way a queen was meant to stand, to speak, to hold herself before a room full of powerful, skeptical men. It felt strange after so many years of deliberately unlearning such habits, of training herself instead toward invisibility. But the old lessons returned to her more easily than she expected, as though some quiet part of her had simply been waiting, patiently, for permission to remember them fully. On the evening before the council was set to gather, Draven found her once more in the chapel, the wooden box open before her, the tarnished circlet resting in her palms as she studied it in the candlelight. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, stepping into the small room. Isolde considered the question honestly before answering, weighing the fear that still lived heavy in her chest against the fragile, growing resolve that had taken root beside it over the past week. "I do not know if anyone is ever truly ready for a moment like this," she said finally. "But I am no longer willing to wait for readiness that may never fully arrive. Whatever tomorrow brings, I intend to meet it standing, not hiding." Draven nodded, something like pride flickering across his tired features. "Then tomorrow, the entire fortress will finally see what I have known for weeks now. That the strength this resistance has needed all along was never hidden in some distant legend or a rumor spreading through frightened villages. It was here, among us, the entire time, quietly serving those who needed her most, exactly as Marin always intended." Isolde closed the box carefully and rose to her feet, meeting his gaze steadily in the flickering candlelight. Tomorrow, the war council would gather, generals and officers who had spent months, and in Blackwood's case years, searching for the very truth she now carried. Tomorrow, the careful, exhausting life of hiding that had defined her since the age of 4 would finally, irrevocably, come to an end. She was afraid. She would likely remain afraid for a long while yet, perhaps for the rest of her life, carrying the particular weight that came with being seen fully, finally, after so long spent disappearing into shadows. But standing there in the quiet chapel, with Draven's steady presence beside her and the tarnished crown held carefully in her hands, she understood, with a clarity that steadied her racing heart, that fear no longer held the final word over what she chose to do next. Tomorrow, she would walk into the war council not as a servant, carrying trays and refilling cups, but as the last living heir of a kingdom that had never truly stopped waiting for her to come home. The great hall was already full by the time the sun rose the next morning. Generals and officers gathered around the long table, where the worn map still lay spread across its surface, marked now with fresh notations tracking the slow, grinding progress of Thorn's siege. General Blackwood had arrived the previous evening, his booming voice filling the corridors as he greeted Draven with his usual firm clasp of the forearm, and Captain Vance had ridden in shortly after, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the room for any sign of trouble before she allowed herself to relax even slightly. Isolde stood in the small servants' preparation room adjoining the great hall, her hands trembling as Peg, who had been let into the secret only that morning, under strict confidence, helped her dress. Peg's hands shook nearly as much as her own as she smoothed the fabric of a simple, dignified gown that had been quietly procured from among the fortress's limited stores, the older woman's eyes wide, with a mixture of shock and fierce, protective pride that had not fully faded since Draven first explained the truth to her at dawn. "I still cannot quite believe it," Peg murmured, fussing with the collar of the gown, even though it required no further adjustment. "All these months, working beside you, teaching you to knead bread properly, and the entire time you were—" She stopped, shaking her head, her eyes glistening. "Well, I suppose I always did say you handled that kitchen knife like someone who was more than she appeared." "You did say that," Isolde agreed softly, managing a small nervous smile despite the pounding of her heart. "I am sorry I could not tell you sooner." "Do not apologize," Peg said firmly, taking Isolde's trembling hands in her own weathered ones. "Whatever comes next, know that the girl I have worked beside these past months, the one who sat with frightened soldiers, and never once complained, despite the hardest work in this fortress, that girl does not disappear simply because the world learns her true name. Remember that, whatever happens in that hall." Isolde nodded, blinking back sudden tears, and reached for the wooden box resting on the small table beside her. She opened it slowly, lifting the tarnished circlet free, and studying it one final time, in the pale morning light, filtering through the narrow window. It felt lighter than she expected, and heavier than she could have imagined, both at once, the physical weight of tarnished metal carrying within it 16 years of careful hiding, grief, and quiet, patient hope. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Draven entered, dressed in his formal officer's coat, rather than the battle-worn armor she had grown accustomed to seeing him in, his expression carrying a solemnity that matched the gravity of the moment awaiting them both. He paused when he saw her, something unguarded flickering across his face before he composed himself once more. "They are gathered," he said quietly. "Blackwood, Vance, Fenn, and the senior officers. Wren Calder is among them as well, watched closely by men I trust, exactly as I promised." Isolde nodded, her hands trembling as she lifted the circlet toward her head. Draven stepped forward, and without a word, gently took it from her hands, settling it carefully onto her brow himself, his fingers steady, even as his eyes remained fixed on hers, with an intensity that carried far more than simple ceremony. "Whatever happens in that hall," he said softly, echoing Peg's words from moments earlier, "I stand beside you, exactly as I promised." "Thank you," Isolde whispered, and found, to her own surprise, that her voice remained steady, despite the racing of her heart. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and allowed herself, for the first time in 16 years, to fully embody the bearing Marin had taught her so carefully, so long ago. "Then let us not keep them waiting any longer." The doors to the great hall opened, and Isolde stepped through them, Draven walking a half-step behind her, close enough to offer silent support without overshadowing the moment that belonged, entirely, to her alone. The conversation within the hall died instantly, every head turning toward the doorway, and for a long, suspended moment, silence swallowed the room whole. She saw the recognition dawn slowly across the gathered faces, disbelief giving way, gradually, to shock, as officers and generals alike stared at the tarnished crown resting on her brow, at the ancient royal seal pressed into its surface, unmistakable even beneath years of tarnish, to anyone who had ever studied the old symbols of the kingdom's true bloodline. Colonel Fenn rose slowly from his seat, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting between Isolde and Draven, as though searching for some explanation that might make sense of what stood before him. It was General Blackwood who finally broke the silence, rising from his chair with a slowness that seemed, for the first time since Isolde had glimpsed him at the previous council, entirely without his usual booming confidence. His eyes remained fixed on the crown, and when he finally spoke, His voice carried a reverence Isolde had not expected from a man who commanded armies with such thunderous authority. "It is real," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "By every god still watching over this broken kingdom, it is real." "My name is Isolde," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, steadier than she believed possible, given the pounding of her heart beneath her calm exterior. "I was 4 years old when King Cassian Thorn murdered my family and burned the palace to the ground, believing he had ended the royal bloodline of Alderath entirely. He was wrong. I have spent 16 years hidden in plain sight, raised in secret, trained to disappear so completely that even the sharpest-eyed officers among you never once suspected the servant girl scrubbing your floors and tending your wounded carried, beneath her sleeping mat, the crown you have spent this entire war searching for." A murmur rippled through the assembled officers, disbelief and wonder, tangled together in equal measure. Captain Vance studied her with sharp, assessing eyes, though something in her expression had softened considerably from the guarded caution she usually wore. "You served in this fortress for nearly a year," she said slowly. "Tended wounds, carried water, bandaged soldiers who had no idea they were being cared for by the last heir of their own kingdom." "I did," Isolde confirmed, "because that work mattered, exactly as much as this crown matters now. I did not spend these months hiding out of cowardice, nor did I reveal myself today simply because it grew safe to do so. I revealed myself because I have watched this resistance bleed and suffer and hold this fortress against impossible odds, and I could no longer, in good conscience, remain hidden while good people continued dying for a cause I might yet help strengthen." Colonel Fenn stepped forward from among the gathered officers, his expression still shocked but shifting rapidly into something closer to fierce, protective resolve. "The letter," he said, glancing toward Draven. "The one I found in the archive. It spoke of exactly this. A child, hidden in plain sight, serving those who would one day need her most. Written by my nursemaid, Marin, who raised me and protected me until her death 12 years ago," Isolde confirmed, her voice carrying a note of grief beneath its steady composure. "She taught me to wait, to watch, until the kingdom itself was ready to fight for a queen, and not merely a cause. I believe, standing here today, that moment has finally arrived." It was then that Ren Calder rose from his seat near the far end of the table, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of vindication and something darker, something that made Isolde's pulse quicken with renewed wariness. "I suspected something," he said, his voice carrying an edge that drew every eye in the hall toward him. "I searched for proof of your claims, girl, and found none. How do we know this is not some elaborate deception, a servant girl, and a general conspiring to manufacture hope where none truly exists?" "Enough, Calder," Draven said sharply, stepping forward, his hand resting meaningfully near the hilt of his sword. "I have watched this fortress bleed under your growing suspicions these past weeks, and I know precisely what you threatened her with, days ago, by the well. Speak carefully now, or answer for treason before this entire council." Ren's face paled slightly at the direct accusation, but before the tension could fully escalate, General Blackwood raised a heavy hand, silencing the room with the simple weight of his presence. "The seal on that crown matches the old royal records exactly," he said firmly, his booming voice returning with renewed authority. "I have studied them myself, over these past weeks of searching. There is no forgery here, Calder, only a truth that has finally, after 16 years, found its courage to step into the light." He turned toward Isolde, and slowly, deliberately, lowered himself onto one knee before her, his booming voice softening into something far more solemn. "Your Majesty, I have spent weeks searching 3 provinces for exactly this moment, never once imagining you stood among us the entire time, tending our wounded and easing our fears. I offer you my sword and the full strength of my forces, without reservation." One by one, the officers within the hall followed Blackwood's lead, kneeling before her in a slow, cascading wave of recognition and renewed hope, until only Ren Calder remained standing, his expression torn between defiance and the undeniable weight of the room turning entirely against him. Finally, even he lowered himself, slowly and without grace, unwilling to remain the sole figure of doubt within a hall now filled with reverent, unwavering loyalty. Isolde stood at the center of it all, the tarnished crown resting on her brow, watching 16 years of careful, exhausting hiding dissolve into a single, overwhelming moment of recognition, and felt, beneath the fear that still lived quietly in her chest, something far larger taking root in its place. Not simply hope, though hope burned bright and undeniable throughout the room. Something steadier, something that felt, for the first time in her entire life, remarkably like belonging. "Rise," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "All of you. I did not reveal myself today to be worshipped from a distance. I revealed myself to fight alongside you, exactly as I have fought alongside you these past months, only now without the need to hide who I truly am." The officers rose slowly, and as they did, the great hall erupted into a low, urgent murmur of renewed strategy and possibility, the siege outside the fortress walls suddenly feeling, to every person gathered within that room, like a battle that might, at last, be winnable after all. Word of what had happened within the great hall spread through the fortress with astonishing speed, carried from soldier to soldier, servant to servant, until by midday, the entire garrison had heard some version of the story, growing more elaborate with each retelling, though the truth at its heart remained remarkably intact. Isolde walked through the courtyard that afternoon, still wearing the crown, and watched as soldiers who had barely glanced at her during her months of servitude now stopped entirely at her passing, some bowing their heads, others simply staring in open, unguarded wonder. She found Corin near the training yard, standing frozen in place, his wooden practice sword hanging forgotten at his side, staring at her with an expression that shifted rapidly from confusion to disbelief, to something like awe. "It is true, then," he said slowly, as she approached. "Everyone is saying you are the queen, the real queen, the one from the old stories. I am the same person who sat with you the night after your first battle, Corin," Isolde said gently, coming to stand beside him at the fence. "Nothing about that has changed, whatever crown I now happen to wear." Corin studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, awkwardly, lowered himself to one knee, his young face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and fierce, earnest loyalty. "Then I pledge myself to you, Your Majesty, whatever comes next, in this siege or beyond it." Isolde felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion, and she reached down, gently urging him back to his feet. "Rise, Corin. I would rather have your friendship than your kneeling. We have both faced enough fear these past weeks to have earned that much between us, at least." He rose, still slightly flustered, but a small, genuine smile broke across his face as he studied her, as though seeing her clearly for the first time, despite months of familiarity. "My mother always said the resistance needed something more than soldiers to win this war," he said quietly. "She said it needed a reason worth believing in. I think, perhaps, she was right all along." Isolde spent the remainder of the day moving through the fortress, in a strange, disorienting blend of familiar routine and entirely new reality, tending briefly to the infirmary, as she had done every day for months, though now accompanied by a quiet escort of soldiers who insisted, gently but firmly, on ensuring her safety at every turn. Ellen greeted her with the same brisk efficiency she always had, though her eyes carried a new, careful respect as she worked alongside the woman she had, until that very morning, known only as a capable and steady assistant. That evening, the War Council reconvened, this time with an energy entirely different from the grim, exhausted determination that had characterized every previous gathering since the siege began. Blackwood laid out plans for reinforcements, now marching swiftly from the southern provinces, emboldened by confirmation that the rumor they had chased for weeks was, at last, undeniably true. Captain Vance detailed a coordinated strike against the enemy's supply lines along the coast, timed to coincide with a renewed push from within the fortress itself, a two-pronged assault designed to break the siege entirely, rather than simply endure it. "Word of your revelation will reach Thorne's camp within days, if it has not already," Draven said, studying the map with renewed focus, his finger tracing the fortress's defensive perimeter. "His soldiers believe they fight against a scattered, leaderless resistance. That belief will not survive contact with the truth. Some among his ranks may waver, uncertain whether they wish to fight against a rightful queen returned from hiding. Others may fight harder, fearing exactly that possibility." "Then we move quickly," Blackwood said, his booming voice carrying renewed conviction. "Before Thorn has time to shore up the loyalty of his own forces against a truth that threatens the entire foundation of his stolen throne." Isolde listened carefully to every strategy discussed, no longer standing silently along the wall refilling cups, but seated now at the table itself, her opinions sought and considered by generals who, only days earlier, would never have thought to ask a servant girl's view on matters of war. It was a strange, overwhelming transformation, and though the fear that had lived in her chest for so long had not entirely disappeared, it had begun, slowly, to make room for something new alongside it, a sense of purpose that felt, after 16 years of careful hiding, remarkably like coming home. As the council finally adjourned late into the night, Draven remained behind, watching as the officers filed out, until only the two of them remained in the quiet, torch-lit hall. "You handled yourself well today," he said, studying her with quiet admiration. "Better than most rulers I have known handle their first council, and you did it after 16 years of never being permitted to speak your true mind, in a room full of powerful men. I had a great deal of practice listening carefully to exactly these kinds of conversations," Isolde said, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "It seems that practice has finally proven useful." Draven laughed softly, the sound carrying a warmth that Isolde had rarely heard from him during the long months of grinding war they had shared. "Tomorrow, the resistance moves against Thorn's siege, with more unity and more genuine hope than we have carried in 4 long years of fighting," he said. "Whatever comes next, I am glad, more than I can properly express, that you no longer have to carry this alone." Isolde looked at him for a long moment, the crown still resting on her brow, the weight of it settling, slowly, into something she was beginning to understand she could carry, not because it had grown lighter, but because she was no longer carrying it entirely by herself. "Neither of us has to carry any of it alone anymore," she said quietly. "I think that may be the truest change this day has brought." The battle that followed 3 days later would come to be remembered, in the years afterward, as the turning point of the long war for Alderath. Though for those who lived through it, it felt, in the moment, like nothing more than another desperate, terrifying fight for survival. Captain Vance's coastal forces struck Thorn's supply lines at dawn, exactly as planned, cutting off the steady flow of grain and reinforcements that had allowed the enemy army to maintain its patient siege. Within the fortress itself, Draven led a coordinated counterattack through the weakened western gate, his soldiers fighting with a renewed ferocity that surprised even the enemy commanders who had grown accustomed to facing an exhausted, dwindling resistance. Isolde remained within the fortress walls during the fighting, though not hidden away in the infirmary as she had been during the first assault. She stood instead upon the fortress wall itself, visible to soldiers on both sides of the conflict, the tarnished crown catching the pale morning light as she watched the battle unfold below. Word had already reached Thorn's camp of her survival, exactly as Draven had predicted, and the effect upon the enemy ranks proved every bit as significant as Blackwood had hoped. Whispers rippled through the attacking soldiers as they caught sight of her standing atop the wall, whispers that spoke of a rightful queen returned, of a stolen throne finally facing its true reckoning, and more than a few among Thorn's forces found their resolve wavering at exactly the moment their commanders needed it most. By midday, reinforcements from Blackwood's southern forces arrived at last, striking the enemy army from behind in a maneuver that shattered whatever remained of their organized assault. What began as a desperate defense transformed, gradually and then all at once, into a resounding victory. The first true victory the resistance had claimed in over a year of grinding, exhausting war. Thorn's army retreated in disarray by evening, leaving behind supplies, wounded soldiers, and a devastating blow to the confidence that had sustained their king's stolen reign for 16 long years. Isolde stood among the celebrating soldiers that evening, exhausted but triumphant, watching as Draven moved through the courtyard, checking on wounded men, offering quiet words of gratitude to exhausted officers, embodying the same steady leadership that had first drawn her attention months earlier, long before either of them understood what the future held in store for them both. He found her near the fortress wall as the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and gold that felt, after so many gray and difficult days, like a promise finally being kept. "We held," he said simply, coming to stand beside her, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the entire day fighting for something larger than himself. For the first time in longer than I can remember, we did not merely survive, we won. We won together, Isolde corrected gently, watching the last of the retreating enemy forces disappear beyond the northern hills. This victory belongs to every soldier who fought today, to Blackwood's reinforcements, to Vance's coastal strike, to every servant who kept this fortress fed and functioning through months of siege. It does not belong to me alone, whatever crown I happen to wear. No, Draven agreed, a faint smile touching his tired face. But it would not have happened at all without you standing on that wall today, giving these soldiers something worth believing in, beyond mere survival. That is not a small thing, Isolde. That is, perhaps, the largest thing any of us have to offer this resistance. They stood together in companionable silence for a while, watching the fortress slowly transition from the chaos of battle into the quieter, more hopeful chaos of celebration. Soldiers embracing one another, servants distributing what meager stores of food and drink remained for a hard-earned moment of relief. Corin found them there, his young face bright with the particular exhilaration of a soldier who had survived his second true battle and helped, in whatever small way, to secure an actual victory, rather than merely another exhausted defense. They are already singing about it in the courtyard, he said breathlessly, gesturing toward the sound of raised voices drifting up from below. About the queen who walked into the war council wearing the lost crown and led us to victory just days later. I did not think such stories could become true so quickly. Stories become true when enough people are brave enough to make them so, Isolde said, watching him with genuine affection. You were part of that bravery today, Corin, exactly as much as anyone else who stood upon these walls. In the weeks that followed, the resistance began, slowly and carefully, to rebuild itself around the renewed hope that Isolde's revelation had ignited throughout the kingdom. Villages that had once hesitated to defy Thorn's tax collectors now openly declared their support for the returning queen, sending what supplies and volunteers they could spare to bolster the growing rebel forces. Blackwood and Vance, once cautious allies bound together only by shared desperation, found themselves increasingly united under a single, undeniable banner, no longer squabbling over leadership now that a rightful queen stood at the center of their cause, giving every general a shared purpose larger than personal ambition. Isolde herself settled, gradually, into the strange, evolving role that had been thrust upon her so suddenly after 16 years of careful hiding. She did not become, as she had once feared, merely a symbol removed from the ordinary people she had served alongside for so long. She continued visiting the infirmary regularly, continued sitting with frightened recruits before difficult battles, continued the quiet, steady presence that had first earned Draven's trust and admiration, long before he ever suspected her true identity. But she also learned, slowly and sometimes uncertainly, how to sit at the head of a war council, how to inspire soldiers with more than quiet words offered in private corridors, how to carry the weight of a kingdom's hope without losing, entirely, the steady, careful young woman Marin had raised her to become. Ren Calder faced judgment before the war council for his threats against her, and though his punishment proved less severe than some among the officers demanded, he was stripped of his command and sent from the fortress in disgrace, a quiet reminder that ambition, unchecked by loyalty, carried its own particular cost, within a resistance now unified around something larger than any single officer's personal advancement. Draven remained by Isolde's side through it all, his role shifting gradually from the fortress's sole commanding general into something closer to her most trusted advisor and closest ally, a partnership built not on the sudden discovery of her royal blood, but on the months of quiet trust they had built together, long before either of them understood what the future held. Neither of them spoke openly, in those early weeks, of the deeper feelings that had begun taking root between them, somewhere amid the chaos of siege and revelation, though both understood, in the comfortable silences they increasingly shared, that something meaningful had grown between a general and a servant girl who had turned out, against every expectation, to be the queen the kingdom had never stopped needing. The war for Alderath was far from over. Thorn remained upon his stolen throne, his forces battered but not broken, and years of difficult fighting likely still lay ahead before the kingdom could reclaim what had been taken from it 16 years earlier. But as autumn settled over the fortress, and the resistance continued growing stronger with each passing week, fueled by a hope that had once seemed impossible to sustain. Isolde understood, standing once again upon the same fortress wall where she had first revealed herself to the retreating enemy army, that the greatest battle, the quiet, 16-year battle to remain hidden and alone, had finally, truly, come to an end. She was no longer merely a servant scrubbing floors in the shadows of a war she had no power to change. She was a queen, forged not by inherited privilege, but by hardship, humility, and the quiet strength she had learned, while living unseen, among the very people she would now lead. And as she looked out over the fortress that had become, in every meaningful sense, her true home, she felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she was exactly where she was always meant to be.